They didn't come to my wedding. My own parents chose my sister Claire's art gallery opening over the most important day of my life. I stood at the altar in a borrowed dress surrounded by friends, but the 2 seats I'd saved for them stayed empty. The text from Mom came as I was saying my vows. "So sorry, sweetheart. Claire's event is important. We're so proud of you." That was 8 years ago. 8 years of silence. 8 years of building a life they knew nothing about. Then I posted one photo. Just one. My new mansion, $2 million of glass steel, and everything they said I'd never achieve featured in Architectural Digest. I didn't tag them, didn't think about them. But within 6 hours, my phone exploded. "Kelly, sweetheart, it's Mom. Your father's in trouble. We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I stared at that message and laughed. Not the happy kind. The kind that comes when you finally understand that some people only remember you exist when they need something. But here's the thing. They didn't know my success wasn't an accident. My husband, the man they never bothered to meet, died in a construction accident 8 years ago. An accident that wasn't really an accident. An accident my father's company caused and then covered up. So yes, I went to that family meeting. I showed up with contracts, lawyers, and evidence that would destroy everything they'd spent a lifetime building. They wanted my money. I wanted justice. And what I'm about to tell you. Let's just say they should have come to my wedding. Because revenge is a dish best served in a $2 million mansion. My name is Kelly Bishop. I'm 36 years old, and by every measurable standard, I've made it. CEO of Bishop Design and Build, featured in Forbes' Top 50 Women in Real Estate, owner of a $2 million mansion that Architectural Digest just photographed for their spring issue. But success, I've learned, doesn't fill the holes that family leaves behind. I stood at my downtown office window that Tuesday morning, watching the city wake up below me. Minneapolis stretched out in every direction, glass towers catching the early light. The Mississippi River cutting through it all like a silver thread. My reflection stared back at me from the window. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, the armor of achievement, carefully constructed over 8 years of silence. 8 years since my parents chose my sister's art gallery opening over my wedding. 8 years since I'd heard their voices. My assistant, Jennifer, appeared in the doorway with her tablet, and that efficient smile she wore like a uniform. "Ms. Bishop, the production team from Channel 7 is here for your pre-interview. They want to go over talking points before Thursday's live segment." I turned from the window, slipping back into the role I'd perfected, the successful businesswoman who had everything figured out. "Send them in, and Jennifer, make sure they have the updated portfolio images. I want them to see the women's shelter project we just completed." The pre-interview should have been routine. I'd done dozens of these. Local news loved the story of a self-made woman in a male-dominated industry. They always ask the same questions. How did you break into construction? What's your design philosophy? What advice do you have for young women entrepreneurs? They never asked the questions that mattered. What does success cost? Can achievement fill the space where family should be? Does winning ever feel like enough when you're celebrating alone? I was answering a question about sustainable building materials when my phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. I ignored it, maintaining eye contact with the producer as she scribbled notes. The phone buzzed again, and again. A string of notifications that made Jennifer glance at me with concern. "I'm so sorry," I said, reaching for the phone to silence it. "Let me just..." But then I saw it. A text message with a photo attachment, and beneath it words that stopped my heart. "Kelly, sweetheart, it's Mom. Your father's in trouble. We need to talk." My hands went cold. The producer was still talking something about camera angles and lighting, but her voice became distant, muffled, like I was underwater. I stared at that message, at the casual "sweetheart" that my mother hadn't used in 8 years. The same generic endearment she'd texted me on my wedding day before choosing Claire over me. "Ms. Bishop, are you all right?" I looked up, realizing everyone in the room was staring at me. I'd gone pale. I could feel it, that draining sensation when shock hits your system. "I'm sorry. I need to take this. Can we reschedule?" The producer looked disappointed but professional. "Of course. We'll coordinate with Jennifer for another time." They filed out, and I was alone with my phone, and 8 years of silence suddenly shattered. My finger hovered over the photo attachment. Part of me didn't want to open it. Opening it meant letting them back in even just a crack. Opening it meant acknowledging that after all this time, they still had the power to unsettle me. I opened it. The photo showed my childhood home in Cedar Grove, Iowa, the 2-story colonial where I'd grown up believing that love was conditional and worth was measured by how much you sacrificed for people who never appreciated it. The house looked tired now, paint peeling the porch, sagging nothing like the pristine facade my father had always maintained. A bright orange foreclosure notice was taped to the front door, garish and official. But that's not what made my blood run cold. I zoomed in on the image, my breath catching in my throat. There, barely visible through the kitchen window, was a silhouette. A man's figure standing in the background of the shot. The stance was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched, hands in pockets, that particular way of standing with weight shifted to one leg. Marcus Grafton. The name alone sent a rush of memories flooding back. Marcus. My first business partner 10 years ago, back when I was 26, and naive enough to believe that people meant what they said. We'd started a small renovation company together. My design skills, his supposed investor connections. I'd put in everything, my savings, David's life insurance money, months of work, building a client base. Then one day Marcus disappeared. Along with him went $75,000, my business plans, and my client list. I'd found out later he'd started his own company in Chicago using everything he'd stolen from me. I'd rebuilt from nothing after that. Bishop Design and Build rose from the ashes of that betrayal. I'd sworn I'd never trust a partner again, never leave myself vulnerable to someone else's greed. And now Marcus Grafton was standing in my parents' kitchen like he belonged there. My phone rang. Mom's number, the one I'd blocked years ago but still recognized. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the decline button. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the walls I'd spent 8 years building. But 8 years of silence creates its own kind of gravity. Questions accumulate like compound interest. And despite everything, despite the wedding they'd missed, despite the years of abandonment, despite the way they'd treated me like I was disposable, part of me still needed to know why. I answered. "Kelly, sweetheart, thank God." My mother's voice hadn't changed. Still that particular blend of sweetness and manipulation, like honey laced with something bitter. "I know it's been a long time, but we're family, and family needs to stick together." Family. The word tasted like ashes in my mouth. "What do you want, Mom?" "Your father's in trouble. Medical bills, the business is failing. We're about to lose the house. I saw your feature in that magazine. You're doing so well, sweetheart. We're so proud of you. We just need a little help to get back on our feet." There it was. The script hadn't changed, only the stakes. They needed something so suddenly I existed again. Suddenly they were proud. Suddenly I was family. "I saw the photo," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The foreclosure notice. But that's not what I'm asking about." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her wonder how much I knew. "Why is Marcus Grafton in your house?" The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her scrambling for an explanation. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of that sugary coating. He's been helping us with financial planning. He's doing very well now, you know. He offered to help us restructure some things." Marcus Grafton. Helping. The man who'd stolen from me was now my parents' financial advisor. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient. Something bigger was happening here, something I didn't understand yet. I looked at the photo again, zooming in further on that figure in the window. And suddenly, I saw it, what I'd missed before. Marcus wasn't just standing there. He was looking at something on the table, leaning over papers spread out in front of him. Planning something, calculating. The pieces started clicking together in my mind like tumblers in a lock. My parents' sudden contact, the foreclosure, Marcus Grafton's presence. They hadn't just randomly decided to reach out to their estranged daughter. This was coordinated, planned. They'd all been together this whole time. While I'd been building my company from nothing, while I'd been grieving David alone, while I'd been learning to survive without family, they'd been there in Cedar Grove connected. And now they needed something from me. I gripped my phone tighter, staring at my reflection in the office window. The successful woman in the expensive suit looked back at me, but underneath I could still see that girl in the borrowed wedding dress, standing at an altar watching the door, hoping her parents would walk through it, hoping they'd choose her just once. They hadn't then. And they weren't choosing me now. They were choosing my money, my success, the empire I'd built from the rubble they'd left me in. My voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 8 years of questions, 8 years of hurt, 8 years of wondering if I'd ever been more than a disappointment to them. So you've all been together this whole time. The silence after my words hung in the air like smoke. My mother didn't respond immediately, and in that pause I found myself transported back to Cedar Grove, to the house in that photo, to the girl I used to be before I learned that love in the Bishop household came with conditions I could never meet. Growing up, I understood my role early. Claire was the miracle, the golden child whose every crayon scribble was worthy of the refrigerator gallery. I was the responsible one, the practical daughter who didn't need praise because I was naturally capable. That's what my mother always said, naturally capable, as if competence was a substitute for affection. As if being strong meant I didn't need to be loved. I remember the day I won the Iowa State High School architecture competition. I was 16, and I'd spent 3 months designing a community center that incorporated sustainable materials and universal accessibility features. The judges called it remarkably mature work and visionary for someone so young. I'd won $5,000 in scholarship money and a feature in the Des Moines Register. I burst through our front door waving the certificate, my heart hammering with the kind of pure joy that only comes when you're young enough to believe your parents will share your excitement. My father was in the kitchen, keys in hand. He glanced at the certificate, nodded, and said, "That's nice, Kelly, really. But Claire's gallery opening starts in 20 minutes and she needs a ride. Can you tell your mother I'm leaving?" Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a gentle click that somehow felt louder than a slam. My mother emerged from the laundry room, a basket of Claire's delicate art school clothes balanced on her hip. "Oh, sweetheart, congratulations," she said, but her eyes were already scanning the clothes looking for stains. "Put that somewhere safe. Claire needs her blue dress ironed before your father gets back with her." I stood there holding my achievement, watching my mother iron my sister's dress, and something crystallized in me that day. My accomplishments were footnotes. Claire's needs were headlines. That was the natural order of our family, as fixed and immutable as gravity. Claire. Even thinking her name now brought a complicated tangle of emotions. My sister, with her golden blonde hair that caught the light like spun honey, so different from my dark brown, from my father's near black, from my mother's deep chestnut. As a child, I'd asked why Claire looked so different. "Recessive genes," my mother had said quickly. "Your grandmother was blonde." I'd accepted it the way children accept everything their parents tell them, filing it away as just another way Claire was special, marked as different, as precious. The real shift came when I was 18. My father's construction company had taken on a housing development that was supposed to be his big break, 30 homes in a new subdivision outside Cedar Grove. He'd over-leveraged everything, convinced the project would make us wealthy. Instead, the market crashed, buyers backed out, and the bank came calling. I watched my father age 10 years, in 10 weeks watched him go from commanding presence to hollow-eyed ghost. I was a semester into college at Iowa State, finally studying architecture, finally pursuing the dream that Mr. Dawson had helped me see was possible. I came home for Thanksgiving to find my parents sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of bills between them like a barrier. "We need to talk," my mother said, and I knew from her tone that my life was about to change again. They laid it out simply. The business was bankrupt. They'd have to sell the house unless they could make the mortgage payments. Someone needed to work full-time to bring in steady money while my father tried to salvage what he could of his reputation and rebuild. Claire was in Florence studying Renaissance art on a program they'd already paid for. She couldn't come back, she was too sensitive for this kind of stress, my mother explained. It would break her. "You're stronger, Kelly," my mother said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've always been the strong one. Claire is fragile. This is what families do, they make sacrifices for each other." I withdrew from college that December. I got a job as a secretary at a law firm, then added weekend shifts at a hardware store. Every paycheck went home to Cedar Grove. I lived in a basement apartment that smelled like mildew and heated my dinner in a microwave that only worked if you held the door shut with your hip. Meanwhile, Claire posted photos from Tuscany, from the Uffizi, from cafes where she sketched in leather journals I'd helped pay for. I told myself the story my mother had given me. I was strong. Claire was fragile. This was what family meant. I believed it because the alternative, that I was simply worth less, that my dreams mattered, less that I was the daughter they could afford to sacrifice, was too painful to consider. But there had been one moment, one brief window, when a different life seemed possible. Mr. Dawson, my architecture instructor from high school, had kept in touch after I graduated. When he heard I'd had to leave college, he called me. "Kelly, I have a proposition. My firm is looking for an apprentice. It's entry level, but you'd learn the business from the ground up. And there's a scholarship program through the State Architects Association I could recommend you. You could finish your degree part-time." For 3 months I let myself hope. I met with Mr. Dawson twice a week, learning to read blueprints, understanding building codes, seeing how design became reality. He treated me like I mattered, like my ideas had value. I started to remember the girl who'd won that competition, who'd dreamed in sketches and elevations. Then my father found out. I never knew exactly what he said to Mr. Dawson, but I came to the office one Tuesday and found it dark locked. Mr. Dawson's secretary called me that night. He resigned, effective immediately. "I'm sorry, Kelly." Years later, after everything, I'd tracked down Mr. Dawson. He was retired by then, living in Arizona. Over the phone, he finally told me, "Your father came to my office. He said, 'My daughter doesn't need a man filling her head with unrealistic dreams. She has family responsibilities. If you contact her again, I'll make sure every contractor in Iowa knows you're trying to lure young women into inappropriate relationships.' I had a wife, Kelly, a reputation. I couldn't risk it. I'm sorry. I've always been sorry." I remember going home that day, the day I found the office locked. My mother was in the kitchen, and I noticed something I'd seen before but never really registered: bruises on her wrist, finger-shaped marks already yellowing at the edges. She saw me looking and pulled her sleeve down quickly, too quickly. "I'm clumsy," she said. "Bumped into the door." But doors don't leave finger-shaped bruises. Doors don't make you flinch when someone reaches past you. I opened my mouth to ask to say something, but she'd already turned away, and the moment passed like so many moments in our house, acknowledged and buried in the same breath. My laptop chimed, pulling me back to the present, to my office, to the woman I'd become instead of the girl I'd been. An email notification appeared on my screen, and the subject line made my chest tighten. "The debt your father never paid, and you're living on stolen land." I stared at that email subject line, my mother still breathing on the other end of the phone, waiting for me to respond to her revelation about Marcus Grafton. But I couldn't focus on her words anymore. The past was flooding back, dragging me under, and I was 27 again, standing in a borrowed white dress, learning that even on my wedding day, I would come second. David Chen came into my life when I was 26, working 60-hour weeks between the law firm and weekend construction gigs I'd picked up. I'd finally saved enough to enroll in night classes for my architecture degree, determined to claw my way back to the dream my father had killed. David was the structural engineer reviewing plans for a building renovation my weekend crew was working on. He caught an error in the load calculations that would have caused serious problems, and instead of making me feel stupid, he spent an hour teaching me how to read the engineering specs properly. He had kind eyes the color of warm honey and hands that were calloused from real work, not soft like the lawyers I filed papers for. When he smiled, it reached all the way to those eyes crinkling the corners in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Within 3 months, we were inseparable. Within 6, he proposed with a simple silver band because we were both saving money for the business we planned to start together. Our wedding was going to be small, intimate, real. I didn't want the elaborate production my parents had thrown for Claire's gallery openings, didn't need the performance of prosperity they'd maintained, even while drowning in debt. I wanted a garden ceremony at a friend's farm outside Minneapolis. 30 people who actually cared about us, homemade food and wildflowers instead of expensive arrangements. David's parents flew in from Seattle. His sister Sarah was coming from her research position in Thailand. His college friends, my co-workers, the handful of people who'd become family when my blood relatives had abandoned me. I sent the invitation to my parents with a handwritten note on cream-colored cardstock. My hand had shaken as I wrote, "Please come. It would mean everything." I didn't ask them to pay for anything. Didn't expect them to host showers or rehearsal dinners. I just wanted them there. Just once, I wanted to be the daughter they showed up for. Just once, I wanted to matter more than Claire's latest exhibition or gallery showing, or whatever artistic endeavor was occupying their attention. The morning of my wedding, I woke up in Sarah's apartment where I'd spent the night, my simple white dress hanging on the closet door. It wasn't designer, wasn't even new. I'd found it at a consignment shop, ivory silk with delicate cap sleeves, elegant in its simplicity. Sarah was making coffee, humming something cheerful, and I remember thinking that this was it. This was the day I got to marry the man who saw me, really saw me, and chose me anyway. My phone buzzed at 9:30, a text from my mother's number. My hands trembled as I opened it, hope and dread warring in my chest. "So sorry, sweetheart. Claire has a gallery opening in Chicago, very important collectors. We'll celebrate with you soon. We're so proud." I read it 3 times. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock. They'd had months of notice. Chicago was a 6-hour drive. They could have made both events if they'd wanted to, if I'd mattered enough. Sarah found me sitting on the bathroom floor, still in my pajamas, mascara running down my face before I'd even put on my wedding makeup. "Kelly, honey, what happened?" I couldn't speak. I just handed her my phone. She read the message and I watched her face transform from confusion to fury. "Are you kidding me? Today they're doing this today." David arrived an hour later to check on me. He took one look at my swollen eyes and pulled me into his arms. He didn't say "I told you so," even though he'd warned me not to get my hopes up. He didn't tell me to stop crying or that I was ruining my makeup. He just held me while I sobbed into his shirt, grieving not just this moment but every moment that had led to it, every time I'd been the footnote to Claire's headline. "They don't deserve you," he whispered into my hair. "If they can't see your worth, I'll spend every day showing them what they lost. I promise you that, Kelly. Every single day." We got married that afternoon, surrounded by people who chose to be there. David's mother fixed my makeup. Sarah held my bouquet and made me laugh with stories about David's awkward teenage years. Our friend Marcus, the one who'd lent us his farm, walked me down the aisle because there was no father to do it. When David took my hands at the altar, he was crying, and I realized these were happy tears. Clean tears, nothing like the bitter ones I'd shed that morning. At the reception, as the sun set golden over the fields, and our friends danced to music from someone's playlist, David pulled me away from the crowd. We stood under an oak tree, my head on his shoulder, and he said something I would replay in my mind 1,000 times in the years to come. "One day, they'll realize what they've done. And when they come back, and they will, you'll be so far beyond them, they won't recognize the woman you've become. I promise you that." I laughed, but it was watery broken. "That's a nice dream." He tilted my chin up to look at him, his expression serious in a way I rarely saw. "It's not a dream, Kelly. It's a plan. We're going to build something together. Something so solid and true and successful that everyone who doubted you will have to acknowledge what you've become. Not for their approval, but so you can see yourself the way I see you." That night after the dancing had ended and we'd said goodbye to our guests, I checked Facebook one last time. I don't know why I did it. Some self-destructive impulse maybe, or the need to confirm what I already knew. My mother had posted photos from Claire's gallery opening in Chicago. Beautiful people in expensive clothes, Claire glowing in a red dress, champagne glasses raised. And there in the caption were the exact words from her text to me. "So sorry we couldn't be everywhere at once today. Claire's gallery opening was incredible. Very important collectors. We're so proud." The same text, word for word. She'd copied and pasted it, sending the same generic message to both daughters for completely different occasions. I wasn't even worth original words. I was a checkbox on her list of obligations handled with the same message she'd posted publicly about the event she'd actually attended. I closed the laptop and looked at David asleep beside me. He'd kept his tuxedo pants on but lost the jacket and tie, too exhausted to change completely. Even in sleep, he had one arm stretched toward my side of the bed, always reaching for me. Now, 8 years later, sitting in my office with my mother's voice still crackling through the phone, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the framed photo from that day. David and me under the oak tree, his arm around my waist, both of us smiling despite everything. You could see the empty chairs in the background if you looked closely, the seats I'd saved that stayed vacant. I touched David's face in the photo, my finger tracing the line of his jaw, and whispered the words he couldn't hear. "You were right, David. They came back, but you're not here to see it." My mother was still talking on the phone, something about medical bills and desperation, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was back in that hospital corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of antiseptic burning my nostrils. A police officer asking me to identify my husband's body. The memory hit me like it always did, sudden violence stealing my breath. We'd had 13 months. 13 months of the kind of happiness I didn't know existed, the kind that feels almost mundane in its everyday beauty. David and I rented a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in northeast Minneapolis, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls and the radiator clanked all winter. But it was ours. We'd painted the living room a soft gray together, argued cheerfully about whether to buy the expensive coffee maker or save the money, stayed up late sketching plans for the design build firm we'd launch once we had enough capital. David worked for Midwest Structural Engineering, taking on bigger projects as his reputation grew. I was finishing my degree while working part-time for a small architecture firm, learning the business side I'd need. Every Friday night, we'd order Thai food and spread our financial spreadsheets across the coffee table, calculating how much longer until we could afford to go out on our own. We were so close. Another year, maybe 2, and we'd have the seed money and the client base to make it real. Then came Riverside Tower, a 15-story mixed-use development downtown. It was the biggest project David had ever been assigned to, and he was thrilled. For the first 3 months, he'd come home energized, talking about load calculations and foundation specs with the kind of passion that made me fall in love with him all over again. But that last week, something changed. He'd come through the door with his shoulders tight, his smile forced. When I asked what was wrong, he'd wave it off. "Just some safety concerns with the concrete formwork. Nothing I can't handle. I'll sort it out." I'd trusted him. I'd believed that if it was serious, he'd tell me. I was in a coffee shop meeting with a potential client about a residential renovation when my phone rang. David's supervisor, Tom Hendricks, his voice careful and wrong. "Kelly, there's been an accident at Riverside Tower. You need to come to Hennepin County Medical Center right away." The details came in fragments. Structural collapse on level 12. The concrete formwork had failed catastrophically. 3 workers had been on that level. 2 were in surgery. 1 was dead. I remember thinking as I drove too fast through downtown traffic that David would be devastated. He'd worked with those crews, knew their names, their families. He'd feel responsible even though it wasn't his fault. It never occurred to me that David was the one who hadn't survived. The hospital social worker led me to a room that was too quiet, too clean. They'd laid him out on a gurney with a sheet pulled up to his chest. His face was unmarked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping. But his hard hat lay on a side table cracked clean through. I touched his hand, and it was cold, and that's when my brain finally accepted what my heart had been refusing. David was gone. The man who'd promised to show me my worth every day, who'd held me while I cried on our wedding morning, who'd believed in me when no one else did. He was gone, and I hadn't even gotten to say goodbye. The official report came 2 weeks later while I was still moving through the world like a ghost. Catastrophic material failure. Inadequate safety protocols. And there, in black and white, was David's signature on the safety inspection forms, dated the day before the collapse. The implication was clear. David Chen had signed off on defective work, had rushed the inspection, had prioritized schedule over safety. The company's lawyers said it delicately, but the message was unmistakable. This was David's fault. I knew it was a lie. David was meticulous sometimes, to the point of driving contractors crazy with his attention to detail. He would never, ever sign off on unsafe conditions. But I was drowning in grief, barely functional, and I had no energy to fight a corporation with lawyers and insurance companies and incentives to blame the dead engineer who couldn't defend himself. The funeral was small, like our wedding had been. David's parents flew in. His sister Sarah cut short her research trip. Our friends filled the church with flowers and memories, and at the back, almost hidden, I saw them. My parents. They stood in the last pew, my father in his good suit, my mother in black. They didn't approach me during the service, didn't come to the reception after, but my mother called me that night. "Kelly, I'm so sorry for your loss." Her voice had that particular tone, the one that preceded a lecture. "But maybe this is a sign. You married someone we didn't know, someone who worked in a dangerous profession. This is what happens when you don't listen to family advice about who to marry. Come home to Cedar Grove. Let us take care of you." I hung up on her. Then I changed my phone number. I blocked them on every social media platform. I erased them from my life the way they'd always tried to erase me from theirs, reducing me to an afterthought, a problem, a disappointment. But I didn't fall apart. I couldn't afford to. David's life insurance paid out $150,000. It felt obscene putting a price on his life, but I knew what he'd want me to do with it. I enrolled in a construction management certificate program. I networked with every contractor, architect, and engineer who'd worked with David. I learned building codes and business licensing and how to read the kind of contracts that could bury you if you weren't careful. Within 18 months, I'd launched Bishop Design and Build. Within 3 years, we'd completed our first major project. Within 7, I'd built the empire David had promised we'd create together. Last week, preparing for that television interview, I'd been going through old files and found a box of David's belongings from his office. His coffee mug with the engineering joke nobody else found funny, a framed photo of us. His daily planner. And at the bottom, wrapped in a padded envelope, a USB drive I'd never seen before. Someone had labeled it in David's precise handwriting, "Insurance if anything happens." My hands trembled as I held it. Now my mother's voice, a distant buzz on the phone. I'd been too afraid to open it last week, too afraid of what ghosts it might contain. But now, with my parents suddenly reappearing, with Marcus Grafton in their kitchen, with that email about stolen land glowing on my screen, I knew it was time to stop being afraid of the past. I had a feeling David had left me more than insurance money. He'd left me the truth. I set the USB drive on my desk next to that wedding photo and forced myself back to the present. My mother had finally stopped talking, waiting for my response about Marcus Grafton. I told her I'd call her back and hung up before she could protest. The truth David had left me would have to wait a little longer. First, I needed to understand how I'd gotten here, to this moment where the family who'd abandoned me suddenly wanted back in. Bishop Design and Build started small, smaller than small. My first project was a women's shelter renovation on the north side of Minneapolis. The nonprofit had almost no budget and most contractors had turned them down. I bid the job at cost just enough to cover materials and pay the 2 workers I'd hired. We gutted the building down to the studs, replaced rotted framing, installed new windows that actually locked, created private spaces where women could feel safe while they rebuilt their lives. The director Maria watched me work one day and asked why I cared so much about getting the details right for a shelter nobody would ever feature in a magazine. I'd looked at her, at the building, at the women moving through spaces that would protect them, and said, "Because architecture isn't just about beauty. It's about creating environments where people can heal." She'd nodded slowly, understanding something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. That project led to another, then another. Word spread that Kelly Bishop built spaces with intention, that she understood trauma in a way most architects didn't. My specialty became what I eventually termed trauma-informed architecture, designing buildings that acknowledged the psychological needs of their occupants. Shelters with multiple exits so people never felt trapped. Therapy centers with natural light and sound dampening. Community centers with clear sightlines and spaces that could be both open and intimate. The work was deeply personal, though I never told clients why. Every building I designed was a rebuke to the house I'd grown up in, where love was conditional and safety was an illusion. Every space I created for healing was the space I'd never had. Every woman I helped house was the girl I'd been sacrificing everything for, a family that saw her as disposable. I worked 18-hour days, learned to read contracts that could destroy you, understood material costs and labor negotiations and building codes until I could recite them in my sleep. By year 5, I employed 30 people and we'd completed projects worth $20 million. By year 7, we'd hit $50 million in completed work, and architecture journals were calling me the Phoenix Architect, the woman who rose from tragedy to build something meaningful. I never mentioned my family in interviews. Never spoke about my past beyond the basic facts: widow, self-made, passionate about creating spaces that serve vulnerable populations. My success needed no backstory, no context from the people who'd tried to keep me small. The company was my vindication, proof that I'd never needed them, that everything they'd said about me being naturally capable but unremarkable was a lie they'd told to justify their neglect. At 35, I designed the house David and I had dreamed about during stolen lunch breaks when we were planning our future. We used to sketch on napkins at the Thai restaurant near his office, imagining a home full of light and clean lines, eco-friendly systems, a workshop where David would build furniture and I'd draft plans. I'd kept one of those napkins, David's architectural sketch, barely legible, but full of hope. The house cost $2 million and embodied every principle I'd learned about creating spaces that nourish rather than diminish. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing south for passive solar gain. Reclaimed materials throughout. A workshop in the basement that I never used because the man it was meant for would never fill it with sawdust and laughter. In my private journals, I called it the house that love built, though love had also left it empty. When Architectural Digest reached out requesting a feature, my first instinct was to refuse. The house was private, personal, a memorial to a marriage that ended too soon, but my marketing director Amanda made a compelling case. Think of all the people who'll see what's possible. Young women who think they can't succeed in this industry. People rebuilding after loss. Your story could inspire them. I agreed, thinking it would reach strangers who might need hope. I never imagined it would reach Cedar Grove, Iowa. Amanda posted the Architectural Digest photos on our company Facebook page on a Tuesday morning. Professional shots of the soaring living room, the kitchen where light poured through skylights, the workshop David would never use. Within an hour, 100 shares. By noon, 1,000. By evening, 10,000 people had shared my home across the internet, and the comments overflowed with congratulations and amazement. Then I saw it. Nestled among the genuine responses from strangers, one comment that made my hands start shaking. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart mom." The same words. The exact phrase from my wedding text from Claire's gallery posts, from every half-hearted acknowledgement my mother had ever given. I clicked on her profile with fingers that felt numb. There they were, my mother, my father Claire. All of them commenting on my success, sharing my photos, suddenly proud of the daughter they'd erased from their lives. My father's comment, "Always knew our Kelly would do great things." Claire's, "My amazing sister," with 3 heart emojis. The performance was starting again, the same theater they'd always staged. Only this time, the show was for their friends in Cedar Grove, for their social media connections, for anyone who might see them celebrating a successful daughter and think they were good parents who'd supported her all along. My phone rang. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. Cedar Grove. I let it go to voicemail, my heart hammering against my ribs. 30 seconds later, the notification appeared. I played it on speaker, my mother's voice filling my office with practiced concern. "Kelly, sweetheart, it's Mom. I know it's been a long time, but we need to talk. Your father's medical bills are overwhelming us and the house. Well, you saw the foreclosure notice. But there's something else you need to know, something about that beautiful mansion you built. Kelly, we need to talk about that land you're living on." I listened to that voicemail 3 times, my mother's voice, with its careful inflection on "that land you're living on." It was bait. Obviously. A hook designed to make me panic, to make me call back immediately, demanding explanations. But I'd learned something in 8 years of building a business from nothing: never make decisions from a place of emotion. Never let anyone see you react. Instead, I made a call to Thomas Brennan, a private investigator I'd used for background checks on potential business partners. "Tom, I need a deep dive on my parents' finances. Robert and Linda Bishop, Cedar Grove, Iowa. And there's another name, Marcus Grafton. I want to know every connection between them, every transaction, everything." Tom worked fast. 3 days later, I had a file 2 inches thick sitting on my desk. The story it told was more sordid than I'd imagined. My father's construction company, Bishop & Sons, had been hemorrhaging money for 5 years. The company survived only through a series of loans from something called Grafton Investment Partners, owned by surprise Marcus Grafton. The loans were structured oddly, with balloon payments and interest rates that varied wildly. It looked less like legitimate business financing and more like money laundering with extra steps. But the real revelation was buried deeper in the file. In 2015, my father had been investigated for land fraud. According to county records, he'd sold a parcel of commercial property to a developer from Des Moines for $300,000. The problem: he didn't own the property. He'd forged the title documents, pocketed the money, and when the developer discovered the fraud and threatened to press charges, the case mysteriously disappeared. Tom had found the paper trail: a series of canceled checks to a county clerk named Donald Marsh, $10,000 spread across 6 months. Bribery, plain and simple. The land in question was nowhere near my property. My house sat on land I'd purchased legitimately from a family trust with clear title and proper surveys. The email threat about stolen land had been exactly what I'd suspected: a lie designed to destabilize me, to make me doubt my own success, to drag me back into their orbit off balance and defensive. I was digesting this information, planning my next move, when my phone buzzed with a message request on Facebook. Claire. I almost ignored it. We hadn't spoken in 8 years, but curiosity won. "Don't come home if it's about money. They'll bleed you dry like they did me. I have nothing left. They've chosen their path and I can't save them anymore. Please, Kelly, just stay away." I read it twice, surprised by the admission. The golden child confessing she'd been drained too. Part of me felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. But then I noticed the phone number attached to Claire's Facebook profile visible in her account settings. I ran it through a reverse lookup. The phone was registered to Grafton Investment Partners. Claire was either complicit in whatever scheme they were running, or she was being used so thoroughly she didn't even realize her phone was a company asset. Either way, the warning felt less like sisterly concern and more like a chess move I didn't fully understand yet. I sat in my office that evening looking at the evidence spread across my desk. The fraud, the bribery, the connections to Marcus Grafton, my parents' financial desperation, and David's USB drive still sitting there, still unexamined because some part of me was terrified of what truth he'd left behind. I could have ignored all of it, could have blocked their numbers, deleted their comments, gone back to the life I'd built where they didn't exist. That would have been the smart choice, the safe choice. But I'd spent 8 years wondering why. Why they'd chosen Claire over me. Why they'd sacrificed my education for hers. Why they'd missed my wedding. Why they'd blamed me for marrying David as if his death was my punishment for not obeying them. And now they were connected to the man who'd betrayed me, who might be connected to David's death, and they had the audacity to reach out asking for money while threatening me with lies. I wanted answers. And maybe if I was honest with myself, I wanted them to see what I'd become without them. I wanted them to understand what they'd thrown away when they decided I was the disposable daughter. I packed a bag. Not because I felt obligation or love, but because I was done wondering. I was done letting them be the unknown variable in the equation of my life. I loaded my briefcase with copies of everything Tom had found, the loans, the fraud evidence, the bribery paper trail. I packed David's USB drive, though I still couldn't bring myself to open it. Whatever was on there felt like a weapon I should save for the right moment. The drive to Cedar Grove took 4 hours. I watched the landscape change from urban Minneapolis to agricultural Minnesota to the rolling hills of eastern Iowa. Each mile felt like traveling backward through time, shedding layers of the person I'd become, until I was just Kelly again, the girl who'd never been enough. I passed the Welcome to Cedar Grove Population 7842 sign at dusk. The town looked exactly the same grain elevator, the same main street with its antique stores and coffee shop, the same church where I'd sat through Sunday services, learning that good daughters were obedient daughters. Nothing had changed here. But I had. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home as the last light was fading from the sky. The house looked worse in person than in the photo, paint-peeling gutters sagging the porch steps that my father had always kept immaculate, now visibly rotting. This was what desperation looked like. But it was the figure on the porch that made my breath catch. Marcus Grafton, broader than I remembered but unmistakable, shaking hands with my father like they were old friends finalizing a business deal. My father in his wheelchair, oxygen tank beside him, but his grip on Marcus's hand firm and familiar. These weren't recent acquaintances. This was an established relationship, comfortable and practiced. Marcus turned at the sound of my car, his salesman smile already in place. Then he saw me through the windshield. For just a second, barely a heartbeat, the smile faltered. His eyes widened slightly, his hand dropping from my father's. He recovered quickly, the smile sliding back into place. But I'd seen it. He knew who I was. He'd known I was coming. And the fact that my arrival surprised him even for a second told me everything I needed to know. They'd been planning this reunion. All of it. The Facebook comments, the voicemail, probably even Claire's warning. This wasn't a desperate family reaching out to an estranged daughter. This was a carefully orchestrated play, and I'd just walked onto the stage exactly when they wanted me to. Good. Let them think I was predictable. Let them think I was still the Kelly who sacrificed everything for family approval. They had no idea who I'd become. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking on the cracked concrete driveway. Marcus Grafton's smile had fully recovered, now stretched wide and false. My father wheeled himself to the edge of the porch, and my mother appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel like she'd been in the middle of domestic tasks, though I doubted she'd cooked a real meal in years. "Kelly, sweetheart." My mother descended the porch steps with her arms outstretched, and for a moment, I wondered if she actually expected me to embrace her. I stood still, letting her arms fall awkwardly to her sides. Her smile flickered, but held. "Oh, you look so successful. That suit must have cost a fortune. We've been following your career online. We're so proud of you." The words landed like stones. Proud. As if pride meant anything without presence, without support, without the 1,000 small moments that make up a relationship. I'd built an empire and they'd learned about it from Facebook. "Let's go inside," my father said, his voice thinner than I remembered raspier. "We have a lot to discuss." The house smelled exactly like my childhood coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner old wood that needed refinishing, and underneath it all, something stale and sad. But everything looked smaller, shabbier. The couch where I'd done homework while Claire practiced her art had a visible sag in the middle. The curtains my mother had once kept pristine were faded and dusty. The family photos on the mantel were the same ones from 15 years ago, time frozen in a house that had been slowly dying. I took a seat in the armchair I'd always avoided as a child because it was Dad's chair. A small rebellion sitting in his space. He noticed his jaw tightening briefly before he arranged his face back into a mask of paternal concern. Marcus Grafton settled onto the couch like he belonged there, and I realized he probably visited often enough that he did. My mother busied herself bringing out coffee in mismatched mugs, playing hostess performing normalcy. The front door opened, and Claire swept in 20 minutes late. She wore clothes that screamed expensive designer jeans, a cashmere sweater, leather boots, but her face told a different story. Hollow eyes with shadows underneath cheekbones too prominent, the kind of thinness that comes from stress rather than health. She glanced at me, then away again, like she couldn't quite make eye contact stick. "Sorry I'm late," she murmured, taking a seat on the far end of the couch, as far from me as the room allowed. We sat there like a Norman Rockwell painting of dysfunction, everyone arranged just so, waiting. My mother poured coffee. My father adjusted his oxygen tube. Marcus crossed his legs and examined his fingernails. Claire stared at her phone. And I waited, letting the silence grow heavy and uncomfortable, watching them realize I wasn't going to make this easy. Finally, my father cleared his throat, that authoritative sound I remembered from childhood lectures. "Kelly, I'll be direct, because that's how you are now, isn't it, businesslike?" He paused as if this was a compliment. "The company's in trouble. Has been for years. Medical bills from this cancer have been astronomical, even with insurance. We made some bad investments. The house is mortgaged to the hilt. We're facing foreclosure in 60 days. My mother leaned forward, her hands clasped like she was praying. "We know we weren't there for you before, sweetheart. We made mistakes. But we want to make it right. We want to be a family again. But we need your help first. We need $200,000 to save the house and restructure the business. Family helps family, Kelly. That's what we do." I noticed she said, "be a family again," only after establishing they needed money. The order was telling. Marcus Grafton uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, adopting what I recognized as his pitch posture. "Kelly, I've analyzed the financials thoroughly. Bishop & Sons has solid underlying assets. With proper capital infusion and your expertise in the construction industry, we could turn this around. It's actually a sound investment opportunity. You'd be helping your family and making a smart business decision." They'd rehearsed this. The sick father, the pleading mother, the business advisor with his analysis and reassurances. They'd assigned roles like actors in a play, each one designed to appeal to a different part of me. Guilt, obligation, greed. They'd covered all their bases, except they were performing for the wrong audience. They were trying to manipulate the girl who'd left college to support them, who'd believed that being strong meant being endlessly sacrificial. They hadn't accounted for the woman I'd become, the one who'd learned that strength sometimes means saying no, that love without respect is just exploitation wearing a prettier name. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch until I could feel them getting nervous. My father shifted in his wheelchair. My mother's smile started to look strained. Marcus glanced at his watch. Claire picked at her cuticles. Finally, I set down my mug with a soft click. "I'll consider it." The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. My mother's shoulders dropped. My father nodded like a judge delivering a verdict. Marcus smiled that salesman's smile. "But," I continued and watched them tense again, "if I invest in anything, we do this properly. Legal contracts, full financial disclosure, independent audits, everything documented and transparent. I'm not writing a check based on promises and family sentiment. My father frowned. Kelly, we're family. We don't need— Those are my terms, I said, my voice pleasant but firm. I'll have my lawyer draft a proposal. We'll meet again in 3 days to review it. If the numbers work and everything is legitimate, we can move forward. They exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, my father nodded. 3 days. That's fine. I stood smoothing my skirt, preparing to leave. They thought they'd won. They thought I was the same Kelly, just with better clothes and a bigger bank account. They had no idea I'd seen through their performance, that I'd come here not to be manipulated, but to understand the full scope of their deception. As I reached the door, I turned back as if remembering something minor. Oh, by the way, Dad, I've been doing some research for a potential project in Iowa. Fascinating what you can find in county records when you really dig. I came across some interesting documents from 2015, a land deal that went sideways. We should discuss those too. Just to make sure everything's clean before I invest. My father's face went pale. Actually pale, the blood draining so fast I could see the shift in his complexion. My mother's hand went to her throat. Marcus Grafton's smile vanished completely. I don't know what you're talking about, my father said, but his voice shook. I'm sure it's nothing, I said lightly. We can clear it up when we meet again. 3 days. I walked out into the cool evening air, my heart pounding but my face composed. I'd just shown them a fraction of what I knew, a warning shot across the bow. They'd spend the next 3 days panicking, wondering what else I'd discovered, trying to figure out how to control the narrative. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me, Claire moving quickly in those expensive boots. Kelly, wait. Her voice was urgent, low. I turned. Up close, she looked even worse, the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep. She glanced back at the house, making sure no one could hear us. You don't understand what you're walking into, she whispered. He's dying. The cancer is stage 4. He has maybe 6 months. And he's decided that if he's going down, he's taking all of us with him. Whatever you think you know, it's worse than you imagine. Please, just leave. Let him destroy himself if that's what he wants. But don't let him destroy you, too. She turned and walked back to the house before I could respond, leaving me standing in the driveway with more questions than answers and the sinking feeling that this reunion was going to cost me more than I'd anticipated. Claire's warning echoed in my mind as I drove back to my hotel. He's dying, and he'll take all of us down with him. But what she didn't understand was that I'd already made my choice. I wasn't here to be saved or to save anyone. I was here to ensure that when my father went down, he went down alone, and that the people he'd hurt, David, me, maybe even Claire in her own way, finally got something resembling justice. I called Mark Reeves from my hotel room. It was late, but Mark had been David's closest friend, the best man at our wedding, who'd stood in the back row at the funeral with an expression that had haunted me for years. An expression that said he knew something important, something he couldn't or wouldn't share. Kelly, he answered on the second ring. I wondered when you'd call. I need a secured loan contract, I said without preamble. $500,000. Completely legal, properly notarized, but structured so the borrower will default. Can you do that? Silence on the other end. Then Kelly, I understand you're angry at your family. God knows they've given you reason, but this sounds like you're setting a trap. I need the contract, Mark. Why? What's this really about? I looked at David's USB drive sitting on the hotel desk, still unopened, still waiting. They let David die to save their reputation. I found his USB drive. I know everything. The silence that followed was different, heavier. When Mark spoke again, his voice was rough. You watched it. Not yet, but I will. Tonight. And then I'm going to make sure everyone who played a part in covering up what happened to him faces consequences. Legal, documented, ironclad consequences. Are you going to help me or not? Another pause. Then, I'll draft it. But Kelly, are you sure you want to become what you hate? Your father destroyed people to protect himself. If you do this, how are you different? His words stung because they were meant to. I'm not becoming anything, Mark. I'm simply holding them accountable for once in their miserable lives. There's a difference between justice and cruelty. I'm offering them money they desperately need. If they manage their business properly, they can repay the loan. If they can't, then they lose assets they would have lost anyway to foreclosure. I'm just ensuring I'm the one holding the deed when they fail. Mark sighed. 12-month term house and business assets as collateral with default triggers based on revenue thresholds. I'll build in requirements for monthly financial reporting and penalties for missed payments. If they're running the business legitimately, they'll be fine. If they're not, exactly. Email me the draft by tomorrow morning. Mark's contract arrived at 6 a.m., and it was perfect. The loan terms looked generous on the surface: low interest rate, reasonable monthly payments, enough capital to solve their immediate crisis. But buried in the terms were requirements my father's failing company couldn't possibly meet: maintain monthly revenue above $75,000, provide audited financial statements, quarterly maintain all business licenses and insurance in good standing, and prohibit any additional secured debt without written consent. I knew from Tom's investigation that my father's company hadn't hit $75,000 in monthly revenue in 2 years. I knew his business license had multiple violations pending. I knew he'd already taken out secondary loans from Marcus Grafton that he couldn't possibly repay. This contract gave him hope while ensuring his failure. 3 days later, I returned to Cedar Grove with Mark and a notary public. My parents were waiting in the living room, my father looking even frailer than before, my mother's hands twisting nervously in her lap. Marcus Grafton was there too, playing his role as trusted advisor. Mark spread the contract across the coffee table. This is a secured loan agreement for $500,000, he explained in his professional voice. Standard terms, 12-month repayment schedule with the house and business assets serving as collateral. There are some reporting requirements and performance benchmarks, but nothing unusual for a loan of this size. My father reached for the document with shaking hands, but Marcus intercepted it first, scanning the pages quickly. Too quickly. He was looking for obvious traps for language that screamed danger. But Mark had been brilliant. Everything looked standard templates pulled from legitimate lending agreements. The poison was in the details and the numbers that seemed reasonable on paper, but were impossible in practice. Looks fine to me, Marcus said, passing it to my father. Very fair terms, actually. The interest rate is below market. My father flipped through the pages, barely reading. He was desperate dying, and desperate dying men don't read fine print. They grab lifelines and hope. Where do I sign? He asked. Mark pointed to the signature lines, and my father signed without hesitation. My mother signed as co-borrower. Marcus signed as witness. The notary stamped everything official. Mark set up his phone to record, explaining it was standard documentation for tax purposes, and everyone nodded, smiling for the camera as they signed away everything they owned. My mother was crying when she hugged me, actual tears streaming down her face. Thank you, sweetheart. You've saved us. I knew you'd come through. You're such a good daughter. My father gripped my hand with surprising strength. I knew you'd come through, Kelly. You always do. That's what family means. I smiled, but the expression felt frozen on my face, a mask I was wearing to get through this performance. Of course, Dad. Family helps family. Mark handed everyone copies of the signed agreement, and we left with the originals safely in his briefcase. As I drove away from that house, I felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, no satisfaction. Just a cold certainty that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. I made 3 phone calls from my car. The first was to the Iowa State Licensing Board, filing a formal complaint about safety violations at Bishop & Sons. I provided documentation Tom had uncovered: failed inspections, expired insurance, OSHA complaints that had been ignored. The complaint was anonymous, but it was backed by enough evidence to trigger a formal investigation. The second call was to the IRS tip line. I reported suspicious business deductions, inflated expenses, possible tax fraud. I provided account numbers, dates, amounts. Everything Tom had found in those financial records my father had been foolish enough to disclose. The third call was to Rachel Morgan, a journalist I'd met at a construction industry conference. She specialized in exposing corruption and safety violations. Rachel, I have a story for you about a construction company that's been operating with expired licenses, falsified safety reports, and a history of fraud. Interested? She was very interested. I wasn't just collecting a debt. I was dismantling them piece by piece using the systems they'd spent years circumventing. My father thought he could bribe his way out of consequences, threaten people into silent sacrifice, whoever was convenient to protect himself. I was going to show him what happened when someone fought back using truth instead of lies, legal channels instead of corruption. That night alone in my hotel room, I finally opened David's USB drive. My hands shook as I clicked on the single video file dated the day before he died. The screen filled with David's face, and I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out. He looked so young, so worried, so alive. "Kelly," his recorded voice said, and my heart broke all over again. "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and you need to know who's really responsible." David's face filled my laptop screen, and the world narrowed to just him and me, separated by 8 years and the unbridgeable distance between life and death. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept. Behind him, I could see our apartment, the kitchen where we'd eaten breakfast together that last morning, where I'd kissed him goodbye without knowing it was goodbye. "Kelly," he said, and my breath caught. His voice. God, I'd forgotten the exact cadence of his voice. "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and you need to know who's really responsible." He leaned back, rubbing his face with both hands in that gesture he always made when he was stressed. "I found something at Riverside Tower that I can't ignore. The concrete mixture doesn't meet code specifications, not even close. Someone switched to a cheaper supplier and falsified all the testing reports. The cylinders that are supposed to prove the concrete strength, they're fake. Someone ran tests on completely different batches and submitted those results." My hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles went white. "If I report this, the project shuts down immediately. The contractor goes bankrupt, probably faces criminal charges. And Kelly..." He paused, his eyes filling with something that looked like anguish. "The contractor is your father's company, Bishop & Sons. He's the one who changed the specifications. He made the deal with the cheaper supplier to save money. He falsified the testing documentation." The hotel room felt too small, suddenly airless. My father. David had known it was my father. "I confronted him today at the site office. David's voice broke slightly. "He begged me to stay quiet. He said it would destroy your family, that your mother needs expensive medical treatments for some condition I didn't know about, that this contract is the only thing keeping his company afloat. He said if I report him, your parents lose everything. He asked me to do it for you, Kelly, to protect you from the fallout." I wanted to reach through the screen to tell David that my father was a liar, that he'd been using me as a weapon against other people my entire life. "Don't believe him," I wanted to scream. "Don't let him manipulate you." But David was already gone, and this video was all that remained of that terrible decision he'd had to make alone. "I don't know what to do," David continued, and I could see the genuine torment on his face. "If I report him, I destroy your family. You'll lose your parents, probably whatever relationship you have with Claire. The scandal will touch you too. People will ask what you knew when you knew it. Your father made that very clear." He looked directly at the camera, directly at me across the years. "But if I don't report it, someone could die. That concrete won't hold the loads it's rated for. When they pour the upper floors, when the building is fully loaded, something could fail. And I'll have known. I'll have been complicit." The video jumped slightly, like he'd paused recording and started again. When it resumed, David's jaw was set with determination. "I'm going to the site early tomorrow morning to document everything. I'm taking photos of the concrete pours, the supplier invoices, everything. Then I'm reporting it to the building inspector and OSHA. I have to, but I wanted you to know why in case something happens. Your father threatened me today, Kelly. He said if I ruin him, he'll make sure everyone knows you knew about the fraud too. He'll tell investigators that you were involved from the beginning, that you helped him plan it. He said he'll destroy your career before it even starts. He'll make you unemployable in this industry. Tears were streaming down my face, now hot and angry. My father had threatened David, had used me as a shield, as leverage, as a weapon. I won't let him do that to you, David said fiercely. I'm documenting everything, including this conversation with him. I'm making copies of all the evidence and sending them to Mark Reeves with instructions to protect you if anything happens to me. You're not part of this, Kelly. You're innocent. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that. His expression softened, and fresh tears welled in his eyes. I'm doing this to protect you, not hurt you. I love you more than anything in this world. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that your family put us in this position. I'm sorry that I have to choose between your family and doing the right thing. But I'm choosing right. I'm choosing safety. I'm choosing integrity. Because that's what you'd do. That's what you'd want me to do, even if it costs us everything. He reached toward the camera and the video ended abruptly. I checked the timestamp through my tears. 6:47 a.m. on the day he died. The collapse happened at 7:15 a.m. I played it again, and again, and again. Each time, David's words carved themselves deeper into my understanding. He'd gone to the site to document my father's fraud. He'd been there early before the work crew arrived, taking photos and gathering evidence. And while he was there, the structure collapsed. My father's company had blamed David. I remembered the official report now with horrible clarity. Structural engineer David Chen signed off on inadequate safety measures. They'd produced documents with his signature. Everyone believed it because why would a company destroy its own engineer's reputation unless he was truly at fault? But David hadn't signed off on anything. My father had forged those documents after David died. He'd taken the man who was about to expose his fraud and turned him into the scapegoat. He'd destroyed David's reputation to save his own. And he'd done it while standing in the back of the funeral, watching me grieve, letting me believe that my husband's death was a terrible accident, an act of God, a tragedy with no villain. I'd spent 8 years mourning David, while my father had spent 8 years protected by David's silenced voice, protected by the lie he'd constructed from my husband's corpse. The cold fury that had been building in me since I'd received my mother's phone call crystallized into something harder, sharper. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about truth. About ensuring that David's death meant something, that his choice to do the right thing wasn't erased by my father's corruption. I reached for my phone to call Mark to tell him I'd finally watched the video, to ask what we could do with this evidence after 8 years. But before I could dial, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Federal agents raid local investment firm in fraud investigation, Marcus Grafton taken into custody. I clicked on the article, my heart pounding. FBI agents had raided Grafton Investment Partners' offices in Chicago early this morning. Marcus Grafton had been arrested on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. The article mentioned a multi-year Ponzi scheme, falsified investment returns, and several co-conspirators who had not yet been named. Several co-conspirators. I thought about the loans from Marcus to my father's company, the strange payment structures, the way Marcus had been sitting in my parents' living room like family, the phone registered to his company that Claire was using. Marcus Grafton hadn't just betrayed me 10 years ago when he stole from our startup. He'd been running a much larger operation, and my father had been part of it. Maybe Claire too, willingly or not. And now the FBI was involved. My carefully constructed plan to dismantle my father's company through legal channels suddenly seemed quaint. I'd been preparing to use civil law business regulations licensing boards. But if my father was entangled in federal crimes with Marcus Grafton, this was about to become much bigger than I'd anticipated. I looked at David's face frozen on my laptop screen in that final moment before the video ended. He'd died trying to expose one crime. Now I was uncovering a web of crimes that stretched far beyond a single construction project. "I'll finish what you started," I whispered to his image. "I promise you, David, everyone who played a part in this is going to face consequences. Every single one of them." My phone rang. Mark Reeves. I answered immediately. "Kelly, are you watching the news?" "Just saw it. Marcus Grafton." "There's more. The FBI wants to talk to anyone who's had financial dealings with Grafton in the past decade. That includes your parents. Kelly, if your father took money from Grafton's operation, he's not just facing business fraud charges. He could be part of a federal case." I smiled, and it felt like ice spreading across my face. "Good. Let them investigate. I have a video I need to send you. Something David recorded the day before he died. I think the FBI is going to be very interested in what he had to say." The Marcus Grafton story exploded across the news cycle like a bomb. Within 48 hours, every major outlet was covering it. Securities fraud, money laundering, a Ponzi scheme that had been operating for 7 years, stealing from retirees and pension funds. The FBI had seized his offices, frozen his accounts, and arrested 3 of his associates. But the detail that made my blood sing was buried in the 3rd paragraph of the Chicago Tribune article. Investigators had discovered that Grafton Investment Partners had been using several Midwestern construction companies as laundering operations, creating fake contracts and inflated invoices to move money through seemingly legitimate businesses. One of those companies was Bishop & Sons. I hadn't just tipped off the FBI months ago through Tom's carefully worded anonymous report. I'd waited watching the investigation build, knowing that timing was everything. I'd waited until after my parents signed that secured loan, until after they'd committed themselves legally to repaying me. Because now every dollar they'd borrowed from Marcus over the years wasn't just bad debt. It was evidence. They weren't just failing business owners anymore. They were potential accessories to federal crimes. The 12 months passed like a slow-motion car crash. I watched from Minneapolis as my father's company struggled as the monthly financial reports Mark required came in showing revenue dropping month after month. The state licensing investigation I'd triggered found multiple violations. The IRS audit I'd instigated uncovered undeclared income and fraudulent deductions. And through it all, my parents kept calling, asking for extensions for flexibility, for understanding. I gave them nothing. Exactly 1 year after the signing, Mark sent the default notice via certified mail and email. Revenue thresholds not met for 10 consecutive months. Loan in default. Foreclosure proceedings initiated per contract terms. My father called me 30 minutes after receiving it, his voice desperate and thin. "Kelly, please. We can fix this. Just give us more time. The company's turning around, I swear. We just need another 6 months." "The contract was very clear, Dad. 12 months. You had 12 months to meet the terms. But the investigation, the Marcus situation, it's killed our reputation. No one will hire us. It's not fair to hold us to those revenue numbers when what? When your criminal associate got arrested, when your decades of fraud finally caught up with you." Those sound like exactly the kind of circumstances that prove why those terms existed. My mother grabbed the phone. "Kelly, we're your parents. You can't do this to us. We'll be homeless." "You should have thought about that before you missed my wedding. Before you let David die and then destroyed his reputation. Before you spent my entire childhood teaching me that I was worth less than nothing." My voice was calm cold. "The contract stands. You have 72 hours to vacate the property." Mark filed the paperwork that afternoon. The transfer was clean, legal, ironclad. All assets, the house, the business equipment, the vehicles, everything moved to my name. The bank processed it without question because every document was perfect, every signature notarized, every clause enforceable. In 72 hours, I owned everything my parents had spent their lives building. I gave them a rental allowance enough for a small apartment in Cedar Grove. I told people it was charity generosity toward family who'd fallen on hard times. But really, it was strategy. I wanted them close enough to watch what came next. Because I wasn't finished. I'd been avoiding the television interview for weeks, the one Channel 7 had been trying to reschedule since that first interrupted session. Now I called them back. "I'm ready," I told the producer. "But I have a different story to tell than the one you expected." The interview aired on a Thursday evening. I sat across from Jennifer Walsh, the veteran anchor who'd built her career on hard-hitting local investigations. She thought she was getting a feel-good piece about a successful female architect. Instead, I handed her the story of the year. I told her everything. The childhood of favoritism and neglect. The wedding my parents had skipped. The years of silence. And then, my voice steady and clear, I told her about David. About the fraud he'd discovered. About my father's threats. About the collapse that killed him and the forged documents that destroyed his reputation. I showed her papers, bank records, email printouts. And then, with her permission and full legal clearance from Mark, I played 30 seconds of David's video. Just enough. His face on the screen, his voice saying, "The contractor is your father's company. He begged me to stay quiet. He threatened me." Jennifer Walsh's professional composure cracked. "My God," she whispered. "Did the authorities know about this?" "They do now," I said. "I've provided everything to the FBI, to OSHA, to everyone who should have known 8 years ago. My husband died trying to do the right thing. My father spent 8 years making sure no one knew what really happened. I'm making sure David's truth finally gets told." The interview went viral before it even finished airing. By the next morning, it had been shared 50,000 times. News outlets across the country picked it up. Local architect exposes father's role in husband's death. Construction fraud led to fatal collapse. Woman takes down father who destroyed her life. My parents became infamous overnight. Their names were everywhere attached to words like fraud, corruption, manslaughter. In Cedar Grove, neighbors who'd known them for 40 years crossed the street to avoid them. Their church asked them to worship elsewhere. The coffee shop where my father had held court for decades told him not to come back. I felt nothing watching it unfold. No triumph, no guilt. Just a cold satisfaction that the truth was finally public, that David's name was being cleared, that the lies were crumbling. My phone rang late that night. My mother, her voice destroyed by crying. "You've destroyed us, Kelly. Completely destroyed us. I hope you're happy." She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "But you don't know everything. You don't know the whole truth about who Claire really is. And you don't know what your father did to protect you when you were 8 years old. You think you know the whole story, but you don't. You have no idea what he saved you from." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me sitting in my hotel room with more questions than answers, and the sinking feeling that my revenge had just opened a door I wasn't prepared to walk through. My mother's words haunted me through a sleepless night. You don't know the whole truth about who Claire really is. What your father did to protect you when you were 8 years old. The phrases circled in my mind like vultures picking at the certainty I'd built my revenge upon. I'd thought I knew the whole story, thought I'd uncovered every lie. But her voice had carried the weight of secrets still buried. And it terrified me that maybe, just maybe, I'd destroyed people without understanding what had made them into monsters. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and drove to Cedar Grove. The house was mine now, legally transferred, but I hadn't been inside since the day they'd signed the contract. I had the keys in my briefcase, part of the asset transfer. The house stood dark and empty, my parents having cleared out their personal belongings in the 72 hours I'd given them. I let myself in, and the silence felt accusatory. I went to my father's study, the room where he'd conducted business, where he'd probably planned the frauds that had destroyed so many lives. The desk was bare now, the shelves empty. But I remembered something from childhood, a moment when I was 12 and had walked in without knocking. My father had been crouched by the wall behind his desk, closing a panel I hadn't known existed. He'd yelled at me to get out, one of the rare times he'd shown me that much attention. I felt along the wood paneling until I found it a section that gave slightly under pressure. The panel swung open, revealing a small safe built into the wall. I tried my birthday as the combination, knowing it wouldn't work. Then I tried Claire's. The safe clicked open. Inside were papers, stacks of them, organized with the kind of meticulous care my father had applied to his frauds. Medical records dating back decades, legal documents. And on top, in a manila envelope labeled simply 1991, a laboratory report from a DNA paternity testing service. My hands shook as I read it. The test was clear, clinical, devastating. Claire Elizabeth Bishop, tested at 6 months old, showed 0 probability of paternity to Robert James Bishop. My father wasn't Claire's biological father. I did the math in my head, the timeline clicking into place with horrible clarity. My parents married in 1986. I was born in 1989. Claire in 1991. My mother had gotten pregnant with Claire sometime in 1990, and it hadn't been with her husband. But my father had known. Had known from the moment he'd ordered this test when Claire was 6 months old. And he'd stayed. He'd raised Claire as his daughter anyway, never divorcing my mother, never publicly acknowledging the betrayal. He'd loved Claire, or at least performed love so convincingly that even I, watching jealously from the sidelines, had believed it was real. I sat on the floor of the empty study, surrounded by the evidence of this ancient betrayal, and tried to understand. Why had he stayed? Why had he poured affection onto Claire while withholding it from me, his actual biological child? And then the memories started replaying with new context, like watching a familiar movie with the sound finally turned on. My father's constant gifts to Claire, the way he showed up to every one of her art shows, was that love? Or was it performance? A public display meant to prove to everyone, especially my mother, that he was the bigger person, the magnanimous husband who could forgive. My mother's desperate attempts to keep Claire happy, to shield her from any criticism or discomfort. Was that normal maternal protection? Or was it guilt? Guilt for bringing a child of infidelity into this family, for forcing everyone to live with the evidence of her betrayal. And my father's face. The expression I'd seen sometimes when he looked at Claire. I'd always interpreted it as pride. But now I wondered if it had been pain. Sadness. The look of a man confronting the daily reminder that his wife had chosen someone else, even briefly. I remembered my mother saying once during one of our rare conversations before I'd cut them off, "Your father sacrificed everything for this family." I thought she meant money, his business reputation. But now I understood. He'd sacrificed his pride, his self-respect, his relationship with his actual daughter, because every time he looked at me, did he see what he'd lost? Did he punish me for being real? While Claire was a lie he had to pretend to believe. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He'd made me pay for my mother's affair. He'd sacrificed his relationship with me to maintain the fiction of his marriage, to avoid the shame of divorce, to prove he was strong enough to absorb this betrayal without breaking. But he had broken. They'd all broken. And they'd broken me in the process. I pulled out my phone and called Claire. It was 4 a.m, but she answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep and something that might have been fear. "Kelly, what's wrong?" "Did you know?" I asked without preamble, my voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Silence. Then cautiously, "Know what?" "About Dad. About who your father really is." The silence stretched longer this time, and I could hear her breathing, could almost hear her trying to understand what I was asking. "Kelly, what are you talking about? Dad is my father. I don't understand." And in that moment, I knew she was telling the truth. Claire had no idea. She'd lived her entire life as Daddy's princess, the golden child, never understanding that her existence was both the crime that had shattered this family and the punishment we'd all been serving ever since. She was innocent. Complicit in my suffering through her ignorance, yes, but innocent of the original sin that had poisoned everything. I felt sick suddenly, violently sick. I'd destroyed Claire's life along with our parents. I'd taken everything from her, her home, her sense of family, her place in the world, to punish people for crimes she hadn't even known existed. "Nothing," I said, my voice hollow. "I'm sorry I woke you. Go back to sleep." I hung up before she could ask more questions, before I could shatter whatever remained of her world. She'd find out eventually the DNA test was in my possession, now part of the house's contents. But I didn't have to be the one to tell her. I'd done enough damage. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Ms. Bishop?" An unfamiliar woman's voice. "This is Mercy General Hospital in Cedar Grove. Your father, Robert Bishop, has been admitted with acute heart failure. He's asking for you. The doctors don't think he has much time. He says he needs to tell you something before he dies. He says he needs to tell you what he did to protect you and why your mother will never forgive herself." I stood in the empty study holding the DNA test that had destroyed our family and realized my revenge had brought me exactly where my father wanted me, back to his bedside, still dancing to his manipulation, still trying to understand the man who'd spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't enough. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I heard myself say, and wondered if I'd ever really escaped this house at all. The hospital room was exactly what I expected: antiseptic white walls, machines beeping their monotonous rhythms, the medicinal smell that can't quite mask the underlying scent of decay. What I didn't expect was how small my father looked in that bed, diminished by illness and time. The man who'd loomed over my childhood like a thundercloud had shrunk to something fragile, tethered to life by tubes and monitors and sheer stubborn will. He turned his head when I entered, and his eyes were clear despite the oxygen mask. Clear and aware, and filled with something I'd never seen before: resignation. He lifted a trembling hand to pull the mask aside. "You came," he rasped. "You're dying. The nurse said you had something to tell me." I pulled a chair to the bedside but didn't sit. "So tell me." "I don't want your forgiveness," he said, each word costing him effort. "I don't deserve it. Never did. But you deserve the truth, and I'm running out of time to give it to you." I crossed my arms, waiting. This was another manipulation, had to be. Even dying my father was working an angle. "When you were 8 years old, I did something unforgivable." His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, they were wet. "I came home drunk. You'd spilled juice on my construction plans, the ones spread on the kitchen table. I lost control. I hit you, Kelly. Hard enough to leave bruises. Hard enough that you hid in your closet for 3 hours before your mother found you." The memory surfaced like something dredged from deep water, dark, distorted but undeniably real. The closet. The smell of my mother's coats. The way my cheek had throbbed. I'd buried it so deep I'd convinced myself it never happened. "Your mother found you," he continued. "She saw what I'd done. She threatened to leave, to expose me, to destroy me. I begged her to stay. I promised I'd never touch you again. But she didn't trust promises. She had a condition." "What condition?" "That I keep my distance from you. She believed if I wasn't close to you, I couldn't hurt you. If I never spent time alone with you, never became the kind of father who'd have opportunity to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "She thought distance was protection." I felt something shift in my chest, a recontextualization so profound it made me dizzy. My mother's coldness toward me, had it been protection? My father's absence from my life, had it been a bargain struck to keep me safe? "Then Claire was born," my father said, and his voice took on a harder edge. "I saw the hospital records. Wrong blood type. Genetic markers that didn't match. I knew immediately she wasn't mine. Your mother confessed before I could confront her. Someone from her support group for abuse survivors. A weak moment," she said. "A mistake." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made the monitors spike. When he recovered, his eyes found mine again. "She begged me to forgive her, to raise Claire as my own, to keep the family together. And I agreed. But Kelly, I was so angry, angrier than I'd ever been. So I made a choice. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I poured all my attention onto Claire, not because I loved her more than you, but because loving her hurt your mother. Every time I favored Claire, every time I chose her over you, your mother died a little inside. She knew what I was doing. She knew I was punishing her by withholding love from you, her biological daughter, while showering it on Claire, the proof of her betrayal. The cruelty of it took my breath away. So, I was collateral damage, in a war between the two of you. Yes. The word came out like a confession, like a plea. You were innocent, and I used you as a weapon. Your mother tried to protect you by keeping me away, and I punished her by making you feel unloved. We destroyed you together, Kelly. Both of us. In different ways for different reasons. But we destroyed you. I wanted to feel vindicated, to feel that my revenge had been justified. Instead, I felt hollow. These weren't the cartoon villains I'd been fighting. They were broken people who'd broken their daughter while trying to survive their own damage. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see Mark Reeves standing in the doorway, a manila folder in his hands. His expression was grave. "I've been waiting for this moment," he said, stepping into the room. "Kelly, your father's telling you part of the truth, but not all of it." My father's face went pale. "Mark, don't. She deserves to know everything." Mark pulled legal files from the folder. "David hired me 2 days before he died. He came to my office terrified and determined. He wanted to report your father's fraud, but he also wanted to protect Kelly from being implicated. He knew your father would try to destroy her reputation along with his own." Mark spread documents across the foot of my father's hospital bed. "These prove that David tried to stop the collapse. He filed a formal report with the building inspector the night before he died, detailing every specification violation, every falsified test result, everything. He documented your threats, Robert. He documented your attempts to coerce him into silence." My father turned his face away. "The building inspector never acted on David's report," Mark continued, "because your father had it buried. He called in favors, paid bribes, made the report disappear from official records. David died the next morning, and your father used forged documents to blame him for the very violations David had tried to stop." I looked at my father, this dying man who'd orchestrated so much destruction. "You let everyone believe David was at fault. You destroyed his reputation to save your own." "Yes," my father whispered. Mark wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one older, more worn. "This is David's life insurance beneficiary form. He changed it the day before he died, Kelly, the day he knew he was going into danger." I took the form with numb fingers. My name was there designated for 50% of the payout, but the other 50% was assigned to someone I'd never heard David mention. "Sarah Chen," I read aloud. "Who is Sarah Chen?" "David's younger sister," Mark said gently. "They were estranged family issues he never talked about much, but he reconnected with her 2 weeks before he died. He told her everything about the fraud, about the danger. He sent her copies of all his evidence and instructions to give it to you and the authorities if anything happened to him." My heart was pounding. David had a sister. Why didn't she come forward after he died? She was in Thailand on a research fellowship. She didn't get his package for 3 months. By the time she returned to the States, the case was closed and she didn't know how to find you. You'd changed your name back to Bishop, moved, disappeared. Mark met my eyes. "But she's been looking for you, Kelly. And now that your story is all over the news, she knows where you are. She wants to meet you. She has things David wanted you to have." I looked down at the beneficiary form, at David's signature, at this sister I'd never known existed. My husband had died trying to protect me, and I'd spent 8 years not knowing the full truth of his sacrifice. Not knowing he'd had family who might have helped me through the grief. Not knowing how thoroughly my father had manipulated every aspect of that tragedy. "Where is she?" I asked Mark. "Where is Sarah Chen?" "She's downstairs in the hospital cafeteria," Mark said. "She's been waiting to see if you'd be willing to meet her." I left my father in that hospital room without another word, Mark following close behind as I made my way to the cafeteria. My mind was reeling from the revelations, from the complexity of motives, and damage from the realization that the story I'd been telling myself for 8 years was only a fraction of the truth. Sarah Chen was sitting at a corner table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. I recognized her immediately, even though we'd never met. She had David's eyes, that warm honey color that had made me feel safe. She had his jaw determined and slightly square. She was 32, Mark had said, which meant she'd been 24 when David died, probably finishing graduate school while her brother was trying to expose fraud that would get him killed. She stood when she saw me, her expression uncertain, hopeful, afraid. Kelly. Sarah. I didn't know what else to say. This woman was a link to David. I'd never known existed a piece of him that had survived. We sat, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry it took so long to find you. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed someone who understood what you'd lost." Mark said David reached out to you before he died. 2 weeks before. She pulled a worn folder from the bag beside her chair. David and I weren't close growing up. Our parents divorced when we were young. Bad divorce, lots of anger. I went with Mom to Seattle, he stayed with Dad in Minnesota. We'd exchange Christmas cards, occasional emails, but we weren't really in each other's lives. Her eyes filled with tears. And then he called me terrified. He said he'd found something dangerous at work, that he was scared of what might happen if he reported it. He needed someone outside the situation to hold on to evidence someone his employer wouldn't think to intimidate. She slid the folder across the table. He mailed me this 3 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you and to the authorities. But I was in Thailand on a research fellowship studying coastal erosion. Remote location, unreliable mail service. I didn't get his package for 3 months. By the time I returned to the States and opened it, you'd already had the funeral, already disappeared into grief. The investigation was closed. I tried to find you, but you'd changed your name, moved, left no trail. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of concrete pours, close-ups showing visible cracks and separation. Lab reports from multiple testing facilities, some showing the concrete met specifications, others showing it failed catastrophically. Email chains between my father and someone named Rick Paulson at Midwest Concrete Supply discussing cost savings and adjusted specifications and keeping the inspector happy. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten ledger, my father's distinctive block print documenting kickbacks across multiple projects. Dates, amounts, project names, years of fraud laid out in his own hand. David was thorough, Sarah said quietly. He documented everything. He knew he'd need ironclad proof to overcome your father's connections, his reputation in the industry. At the bottom of the folder was a small recording device, the old kind that used mini cassettes. "This is from the day before he died," Sarah said. "He recorded his final conversation with your father." I pressed play, and David's voice filled the space between us. "Mr. Bishop, if you don't report this to the building inspector, people will die. That concrete won't hold the specified loads. When they pour the upper floors, when the building is fully occupied, something will fail." My father's voice, younger and stronger than the rasping whisper I'd just heard in the hospital. "My whole family will be destroyed if you do this. The company will go bankrupt. My wife needs medical care. Kelly will lose everything. I'm begging you for her sake, for your wife's sake, stay quiet." David's response was firm. Kelly would never want safety built on lies. She'd never want people's lives risked to protect her comfort. "Then you don't know my daughter as well as you think you do." My father's voice turned cold. "And if you go through with this, I'll make sure everyone knows she was involved from the beginning. I'll destroy her career before it starts. She'll never work in this industry again." The recording ended. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, hearing David defend my integrity to a man who thought I was as corrupt as he was. David had believed in me, even when my own father didn't. "There's more," Sarah said gently. "David called me the night before he died. He told me he was going to the site early the next morning at 6 a.m. before the work crews arrived. He was going to photograph everything, document all the defects, and then meet the building inspector at 8. He said he'd filed a formal report already, but he wanted photographic evidence to make it impossible for anyone to bury the investigation. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, reading from what must have been contemporaneous notes from that call. He said, "If anything feels wrong tomorrow, if I get any sense that someone's trying to stop me, I'm calling the police immediately." He was scared, Kelly, but he was determined to do the right thing. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He went to the site at 6 a.m. The official report says he stepped onto a scaffolding platform on level 12 and the formwork collapsed under him. Catastrophic structural failure. But Kelly David told me something that night that never made it into any official report. He said someone had been following him for 2 days. A car he didn't recognize parked outside our apartment outside his office. He thought your father was having him watched. My blood ran cold. Sabotage. David suspected it was possible. He told me, if something happens to me, make sure they check the scaffolding. Make sure they look for tool marks for signs of tampering. But the police ruled it accidental. They said the collapse was due to the defective concrete David himself had allegedly approved. The investigation focused on his supposed negligence, not on whether someone might have created the conditions for him to fall. I thought about my father in that hospital bed, dying, confessing to using me as a weapon in his marriage, but not confessing to this. Not confessing to whatever role he'd played in creating the circumstances that killed David. Sarah's phone rang, startling both of us. She glanced at the screen, frowning. "I don't recognize this number." "Answer it." I said, some instinct telling me this was important. She put it on speaker. "Hello. Ms. Chen. This is Detective Raymond Walsh, Minneapolis Police, retired. I investigated your brother's death 8 years ago." The voice was gruff, older, weighted with something that sounded like guilt. "I just saw the news about the Bishop family, about Kelly Bishop's interview. I need to talk to you and Mrs. Bishop about what really happened that morning. There's something I was pressured not to include in my report. Something that's haunted me for 8 years. I'm ready to talk now, if you're willing to listen." Sarah's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw in them the same mixture of hope and dread I felt. "We're listening, Detective. Tell us everything." Detective Raymond Walsh chose a diner on the edge of Minneapolis, the kind of place where cops met informants and people had conversations they didn't want overheard. He was waiting in a back booth when Sarah and I arrived with Mark, a man in his late 60s with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much and carried the weight of it poorly. "Mrs. Bishop, Ms. Chen." He stood to shake our hands, his grip firm but his eyes haunted. "Thank you for meeting me. I've been carrying this for 8 years, and after seeing your interview, ma'am, I realized I couldn't carry it to my grave." We sat, and Walsh pulled a worn accordion file from the seat beside him. "I was the lead detective on your husband's death. The official ruling was accidental death due to structural failure, but that's not what I found in the first 48 hours of investigation." He opened the file, spreading photographs across the table. Close-ups of metal scaffolding, bolts, the threading visible. The day after David Chen died, I went back to the site to document everything. These bolts held the scaffolding platform where your husband fell. You see these marks? He pointed to scratches on the metal, clear even in the photograph. Those are tool marks. Someone used a wrench to loosen these bolts. Not completely, that would have been too obvious, but enough that when weight was applied, the platform would fail. My chest tightened. Sarah's hand found mine under the table. I reported this to my captain immediately. I recommended we treat it as a potential homicide investigation or at minimum criminally negligent manslaughter. I wanted to bring in forensics, interview everyone who'd had access to the site. Walsh's jaw clenched. 2 days later, your father's lawyer showed up at the station. Robert Bishop's attorney, accompanied by a city councilman named Gerald Hartley. They went into my captain's office for an hour. When they came out, I was told to close the case. Tragic accident. No criminal negligence. The evidence I'd collected was to be filed and forgotten. You kept copies, Mark said, gesturing to the file. I kept everything. The photographs witnessed statements I'd collected from workers who'd been on site that week's security footage from the construction office. He pulled out a stack of papers. 3 workers told me they'd seen an unknown person on site early that morning around 5 a.m. A man in a suit, which was unusual for a construction site. One worker got close enough to see he was carrying a briefcase and looking nervous. When I showed them photos, 2 of them identified Marcus Grafton. The name hit like a physical blow. Marcus Grafton, my former business partner, the man who'd stolen from me, and who'd been sitting in my parents' living room like family. Marcus Grafton, who was now in FBI custody for running a Ponzi scheme. Walsh pulled out a grainy printout of security footage. This is from the construction office camera timestamp 5:07 a.m. the morning David Chen died. That's Marcus Grafton entering the office. The figure was blurry but recognizable, the same build, the same way of walking. The official investigation claimed the footage showed nothing of interest, but I kept the original file. Someone erased the timestamp from the official record, made it look like it could have been from any morning. What was Grafton doing there? I asked, my voice barely steady. I believe he was destroying evidence. David Chen had documented fraud material samples, paperwork, test results. Grafton was there to make sure none of that evidence survived. The scaffolding, sabotage. Walsh hesitated. I don't think they intended to kill him. I think they wanted to slow him down, maybe injure him enough that he couldn't meet with the building inspector that morning. Buy themselves time to complete the cover-up. But structural failures cascade. When those bolts gave way under David's weight, it triggered the larger formwork collapse. What was meant to be intimidation became manslaughter. Sarah was crying silently beside me. I felt numb, frozen, as the full scope of what had happened to David crystallized. My father and Marcus Grafton had conspired to hide fraud, and that conspiracy had killed my husband. Not deliberately, perhaps, but just as dead. Mark spread his own documents on the table, organizing everything Walsh had brought. With this evidence, we can go to the district attorney. Between Walsh's original investigation, David's documentation, and the current federal case against Grafton, we have enough to reopen this as a criminal matter. What would that mean? I asked. What charges? Manslaughter at minimum, fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of evidence, bribery of public officials. Mark ticked them off on his fingers. Your father will face charges. He's dying anyway, but he'll die in prison if convicted. Marcus Grafton is already facing federal charges that'll put him away for 20 years. This adds state charges that could run consecutively. Your mother could potentially be charged as an accessory if prosecutors can prove she knew about the fraud and the cover-up. She knew, I said quietly, remembering her role in signing documents, making calls, being complicit in everything my father built. She was part of it all. Mark's expression was serious. Kelly, I need to ask you directly, what do you want? Your father is dying. Marcus Grafton is already ruined. You've taken everything they owned. You could walk away right now, let your father die with whatever dignity he has left, let your mother live out her remaining years in obscurity. Or you can pursue full criminal prosecution. But you need to understand this will be public, brutal, and it will consume years of your life. Trials, appeals, media attention. It won't bring David back. I stood and walked to the diner window, looking out at the parking lot where families were getting out of cars heading in for dinner. Normal people with normal problems. People whose fathers hadn't killed their husbands, whose families weren't built on fraud and lies and casual cruelty. I thought about David, about the life we'd planned, the company we'd build together. The house full of light, the children we'd talked about naming. I thought about him going to that construction site, knowing it was dangerous, knowing my father had threatened him, but going anyway because it was the right thing to do. He'd died for integrity. For the principle that safety mattered more than convenience, that truth mattered more than comfort. And my father had spent 8 years making sure David's sacrifice meant nothing, making sure his reputation was destroyed, making sure the fraud continued. I turned back to the table to Mark and Sarah and Detective Walsh. 3 people who'd all in different ways been trying to honor David's memory by holding on to truth when it would have been easier to let it go. File everything, I said, my voice steady and cold. Take it to the district attorney. I want the case reopened. I want full criminal prosecution. Not for revenge, I'm past revenge. But David's name deserves to be cleared. The truth deserves to be on record. And my father needs to face what he did not as a dying man who gets sympathy, but as a criminal who destroyed lives to save himself. Mark nodded slowly. All right. I'll prepare everything and meet with the DA's office tomorrow. And Mark? I met his eyes. Make sure they understand that my mother was complicit. She signed the documents, she made the calls, she helped bury the evidence. She doesn't get to play the victim in this story. Sarah squeezed my hand. Detective Walsh looked at me with something that might have been respect, or might have been relief that someone was finally willing to do what he couldn't 8 years ago. David would be proud of you, Sarah said quietly. I wasn't sure about that. David had been kind, forgiving, always looking for the good in people. What I was doing now wasn't kind, but it was just. And maybe I thought justice was the truest way to honor someone who died trying to do the right thing. Mark worked fast. 3 weeks after our meeting with Detective Walsh, the Hennepin County District Attorney called a press conference. I watched it from my office in Minneapolis, the live stream playing on my computer, while my phone vibrated constantly with calls from reporters I was ignoring. The DA, a woman named Patricia Moreno, with sharp eyes and sharper suits, stood at a podium surrounded by microphones. Today we are announcing the reopening of the investigation into the death of David Chen, a structural engineer who died 8 years ago in what was initially ruled an accidental collapse at the Riverside Tower construction site. New evidence has come to light that suggests criminal negligence and potential manslaughter. The camera flashes were constant reporters shouting questions. DA Moreno raised her hand for silence. We have identified 2 persons of interest, Robert Bishop, owner of Bishop & Sons Construction, and Marcus Grafton, currently in federal custody on unrelated fraud charges. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of a systematic fraud scheme involving falsified safety reports, substandard building materials, and subsequent obstruction of justice to cover up these crimes. She detailed it all, the concrete specifications, the forged test results, the evidence David had gathered, the tampering with scaffolding that led to his death. She spoke about Detective Walsh's original findings that had been buried through political pressure. She mentioned the security footage showing Marcus Grafton on site the morning David died. A reporter shouted over the others, "Will you be filing charges against Mr. Bishop?" DA Moreno's expression was carefully neutral. Mr. Bishop's current medical condition complicates prosecution. He is in hospice care with terminal cancer. However, we are pursuing all available legal remedies. Mr. Grafton will face additional state charges of manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. We are also investigating other individuals who may have been complicit in the cover-up. Other individuals. My mother. The city councilman who'd pressured the police. The building inspector who'd ignored David's report. The whole corrupt network my father had built over decades. By that evening, the story was everywhere. Architect's husband killed by her own father's greed. 8-year cover-up exposed in construction death. Woman takes down father who destroyed her marriage. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. CNN wanted an interview. The New York Times wanted a statement. Local news vans were parked outside my office building. But the real punishment wasn't coming from the media or the legal system. It was coming from Cedar Grove, Iowa. Small towns have long memories and harsh judgments. Within days of the DA's press conference, my parents discovered what it meant to be truly exiled from a community. Their church, First Methodist, where they'd attended for 40 years, asked them not to come back. The pastor called it creating an uncomfortable environment for other parishioners. The Cedar Grove Gazette, the weekly paper my father had once advertised in, ran an editorial titled "The Cost of Corruption in Our Community." It named every project Bishop & Sons had completed in town and questioned whether those buildings were safe. Former clients started filing lawsuits demanding inspections, claiming their homes and businesses might be structurally unsound because of my father's fraud. The book club my mother had been part of for 20 years sent her a polite email explaining that they'd decided to keep the group small and weren't accepting members this season. The grocery store manager, a man who'd known my father since high school, asked him not to return after other customers complained about shopping in the same store as that murderer.
What so, Mrs. Sums?
This was the punishment I couldn't have designed, couldn't have engineered through any legal strategy. My parents were being erased from the community that had defined them, rejected by the people whose approval they'd spent decades courting. They would spend whatever time my father had left as infamous failures pariahs in the only place they'd ever belonged. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Claire's social media post appeared 4 days after the press conference. I saw it because people started tagging me because it was being shared thousands of times with commentary ranging from sympathetic to vicious. "My sister is destroying our family with lies to justify her bitterness," Claire had written. "Our father is dying, and instead of showing mercy, Kelly is dragging his name through the mud with accusations that can't be proven. She's turned our private family pain into public entertainment. She's always been jealous of the attention I received, and now she's punishing all of us for her own failures. Please pray for our family during this difficult time." The comments were brutal. People who'd followed my story called Claire delusional, complicit, blind. They posted links to the DA's press conference, to David's video, to the evidence I'd made public. Someone I never found out who had leaked the DNA test. Within hours, people were tagging Claire in posts about it. "Did you know you're not even his biological daughter? Your whole life was a lie, and you're still defending him." My phone rang at 11 that night. Claire's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "What is this?" Her voice was shaking, hysterical. "People are sending me documents, Kelly. DNA tests saying Dad isn't my father. Tell me it's fake. Tell me you fabricated it as part of your revenge. Please." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I'd unleashed. "Claire, tell me the truth." She was screaming now, sobbing. "Tell me who I am, because I don't know anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about our family, it's all falling apart. Is the DNA test real? Is Dad not my father? Did you know this when you destroyed everything? Did you know you were taking everything from someone who isn't even really your sister?" "Meet me tomorrow," I said quietly. "Riverside Park, 2 p.m. I'll tell you everything." She hung up without responding, but the next day at 2 o'clock, I was sitting on a bench overlooking the river when I saw her approaching across the grass. The change in Claire was shocking. She'd always been thin, but now she looked skeletal, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut her designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that had shed 20 pounds it didn't have to lose. Her hands trembled as she walked, and her eyes had the wild, desperate look of someone whose entire reality had shattered. She sat down on the far end of the bench as far from me as possible, while still technically sitting together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, just watched the river flow past, carrying leaves and debris toward some distant destination. Finally, Claire turned to me, and her voice when she spoke was small, broken nothing like the confident golden child I'd grown up envying. "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Because I don't know who I am anymore." I took a breath and started talking, telling Claire everything I'd found in that safe. The DNA test from 1991. The affair. The bargain our parents had made where he'd raise her as his own, but punish our mother by withholding love from me while showering it on the living proof of her betrayal. I laid it out clinically, like presenting evidence in a deposition, because if I let emotion in, I'd never get through it. Claire sat completely still, her face blank, processing information that was rewriting her entire existence. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I thought she might just stand up and walk away without saying anything. "So, everything was a lie," she finally said, her voice flat. "Dad loved me to hurt Mom. Mom spoiled me out of guilt. And you? You were sacrificed because I existed, because I was the proof of her betrayal, and he could punish her by destroying you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Then Claire started laughing. It was a horrible sound, broken and bitter-edged with hysteria. I thought I was the lucky one, the princess, the golden child who could do no wrong. But I was just a weapon, a tool they used against each other, and against you. She turned to look at me directly for the first time, and her eyes were clear despite the tears. You know what's funny, Kelly? What's absolutely hilarious? I always envied you. What? You were strong, independent, you left and built something real. I was just decorative. They trained me to be pretty and useless, to need their approval like oxygen. When you left and succeeded without them, I realized I had nothing. No skills, no purpose, no identity outside of being their treasured daughter in a family that didn't actually treasure anyone. She pulled up the sleeves of her expensive sweater, and I saw the scars. Thin white lines on her forearms, some old and faded, some more recent. The eating disorder started in college. I had to be perfect to deserve their love, and perfect meant thin, meant beautiful, meant needing them. The anxiety attacks came next, then the depression. I dropped out of art school. Did you know that? I tell people I graduated, but I dropped out sophomore year because I couldn't handle the pressure of actually being good at something. It was easier to be the beautiful failure they expected. Claire. I didn't know what to say. I tried to kill myself twice, once at 23, once at 27. Did you know that? Of course not. They hid it, got me admitted to private facilities under fake names. What would people think? They got me just enough help to keep me alive and presentable, but not enough to actually heal. Because healing would mean gaining independence. It would mean I'd leave them too, and they couldn't lose their weapon. I felt something crack inside me, some wall I'd built between us. Claire wasn't the enemy. She'd never been the enemy. She was another casualty of our parents' toxic marriage, just wounded in different ways. I'm sorry, I said and meant it. For what I did to you with the company, the house, taking everything. You didn't deserve to lose it all. Claire shook her head fiercely. Yes, I did. Maybe not for Dad's crimes, I didn't know about those. But for my own crimes. I knew how they treated you, Kelly. I saw it every day of our childhood. I benefited from it. Every gift they gave me was something they didn't give you. Every art show they attended was a wedding they skipped. And I never once stood up for you. I never questioned why I got everything while you got scraps. I was complicit through silence, through accepting my role in their sick game. She met my eyes, and I saw something in her I'd never seen before, genuine remorse not performed for anyone, but felt deeply. I don't expect forgiveness. I have no right to it. I just want you to know that I see it now. I see what they did to you, what I let them do. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for every moment I stayed silent. We sat there on that bench, two sisters who'd spent 30 years on opposite sides of a war they didn't choose, finally understanding that we'd both been casualties all along. Not friends, not yet, maybe never, but not enemies either. Claire's phone rang, shattering the moment. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. It's the hospital. She answered, and I watched her expression shift from fear to something more complicated. She listened, nodded, then said quietly, "We'll be there." When she hung up, her hands were shaking. "Dad's had a stroke, a massive one. They don't think he'll make it through the night. Mom is..." Her voice cracked. "Mom is asking for us both to come. She wants us there when he dies." I thought about my father in that hospital bed, the confessions he'd made, the crimes he'd committed, the lives he'd destroyed. I thought about David, about the future we should have had. I thought about the little girl I'd been hiding in a closet with bruises, and the woman I'd become who'd spent years seeking justice that felt increasingly hollow. "Do you want to go?" I asked Claire. She looked at me, her face a map of conflicting emotions. "I don't know. Do you?" We drove to the hospital in silence, Claire following in her car because neither of us could bear the intimacy of sharing a vehicle. The hospice wing was quiet when we arrived. Dim lighting and hushed voices, the particular stillness that comes from being a place where people go to die. My mother sat beside my father's bed, and she'd aged a decade in the months since I'd last seen her. Her hair had gone completely gray, her face lined with exhaustion, and something that might have been shame. She didn't look up when we entered. "He's been asking for you both," she said to the wall, to the machines, to anything but us. "Drifting in and out of consciousness. He knows he's dying. He wanted you here." My father lay motionless, his breathing labored and irregular. The oxygen mask covered his face, and tubes ran from his arms to various machines that beeped their steady rhythm. The stroke had been massive, the nurse explained in hushed tones. It had affected his speech centers, his motor control, most of his right side. He might not wake again, but if he did, communication would be difficult. Claire and I stood on opposite sides of the bed, bookends to a life that had damaged us both in different ways. We waited in that awful silence, watching a man die by increments. 20 minutes passed. Then my father's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then landing on me, then on Claire. His mouth moved behind the oxygen mask, trying to form words. A nurse gently removed the mask, and he drew a rattling breath. "Kelly, Claire." The words were slurred, barely comprehensible, but unmistakably our names. "Sorry. So sorry." His left hand, the one that still worked, reached out from the bedding, trembling with effort. He was trying to touch us both to bridge the space between us all, though whether it was genuine remorse or a dying man's last manipulation, I couldn't tell. My mother finally looked at us, her eyes red and hollow. "I need to say this while I can. While you're both here, and he can hear it too." She took a shaking breath. "Your father was not a good man, but he wasn't pure evil either. He was weak, and I was weaker." She stared at her hands at the wedding ring she still wore. "I had the affair because I was lonely, because he'd hurt Kelly, and I was terrified of him and I couldn't leave. I had no money, no job skills, nowhere to go with 2 daughters. When Claire was born and Robert discovered she wasn't his, he agreed to stay married if I helped him hide his business mistakes. I became an accomplice to fraud to keep my children housed and fed. Every choice I made was wrong, but every choice felt impossible." She looked at me directly for the first time. "I saw him hurt you that night. I saw the bruises, and I chose the coward's way out. I thought keeping him distant from you was protection, but it was just another way of failing you. I'm sorry, Kelly, for all of it. For every moment I chose wrong." My father made a sound, drawing our attention back to him. He was gathering strength, marshalling whatever remained of his ability to speak. When the words came, they were slurred but comprehensible, pushed out with desperate effort. "David, good man, better than me." Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes, running down into his gray hair. "Tried to stop it. I was scared. Cost him his life." The admission hung in the air. My father finally acknowledging what he'd done, finally naming the crime. "Kelly." He was fading, his voice getting weaker. "You were the strong one. Always. Didn't need protecting. But I should have loved you anyway." His eyes moved to Claire, and something in his expression softened. "You deserved better. Father. Real one." His eyes closed. The beeping from the heart monitor began to slow the intervals between beats, stretching longer. Claire grabbed my hand across the bed, and I held it, 2 sisters watching their father die, feeling everything and nothing at once. The monitor went from beeps to a single sustained tone. The nurse moved quickly, checking for a pulse, but it was a formality. We all knew he was gone. Time of death. 3:47 a.m., she said quietly, and began the process of disconnecting the machines. My mother sat frozen, not crying, just staring at the man she'd spent 40 years married to, the man who'd terrorized her and trapped her and made her complicit in destroying their daughters. Claire was crying silently, mourning something she'd never really had. I felt nothing. No relief, no grief, no satisfaction. Just emptiness where I'd expected some kind of resolution to be. I walked out of the room down the corridor, following signs to the hospital chapel. It was empty at this hour, just rows of chairs facing a simple altar, soft lighting and profound quiet. I sat in the back row and stared at nothing. My father was dead. The man who'd killed David, who'd destroyed my childhood, who'd used me as a weapon in his marriage, he was gone. I'd spent months orchestrating his downfall, exposing his crimes, taking everything he'd built. I'd gotten my revenge. I'd gotten justice. The truth was on record. David's name was cleared. And I felt nothing. Revenge hadn't made me feel better. Justice hadn't healed the wounds. And now there was no more enemy to fight, no more wrongs to expose. Just wreckage. Just the debris of a family that had destroyed itself long before I'd ever started fighting back. I sat in that chapel as the sun began to rise outside and wondered what came after revenge, what came after justice, what came when the enemy was gone but the damage remained. I had no answer. Just silence and the weight of everything I'd done, and the terrible knowledge that winning had left me just as empty as losing ever had. The funeral was held 3 days later at Cedar Grove Cemetery under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. There would be no church service, the pastor had politely declined, citing the difficult circumstances. Just a graveside ceremony with a minister my mother had hired who'd never met my father, who would deliver words over a man he knew only from the obituary. 7 people attended. Kelly, Claire, and my mother standing together without touching. Sarah Chen, who'd driven from Minneapolis to support me. Mark, who stood a respectful distance back. And 3 elderly men who'd worked with my father decades ago before the fraud and corruption, who apparently hadn't heard about the scandal or had chosen not to believe it. The minister spoke in platitudes about redemption and mercy, about God's forgiveness and eternal rest. Generic words that could have applied to anyone that meant nothing because they said nothing true. When he finished his prepared remarks, he made the mistake of inviting people to share memories. Silence. The kind that stretches and becomes uncomfortable, that makes people shift their weight and avoid eye contact. No one wanted to speak to pretend this man deserved eulogies. Then Claire stepped forward. She was steadier than she'd been days ago, some internal decision made. "My father taught me that love is conditional," she said, her voice carrying across the small gathering. "He taught me that worth is measured by appearance, that weakness must be hidden, that happiness is something you perform rather than feel. These were terrible lessons, but they were lessons nonetheless. I hope he's finally found peace, because he never had it in life. And maybe that's the saddest thing about him, not that he hurt people, but that he was incapable of being happy himself." She stepped back. The minister looked at me expectant, but I had nothing to say. Some graves don't deserve flowers. Some lives don't deserve eulogies. I watched them lower the casket into the ground and felt only that same hollow emptiness I'd felt in the chapel. 2 days later, we gathered in a lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The lawyer, a man named Howard Simmons, who'd known my father for 30 years, looked uncomfortable as he shuffled papers. "The will is quite simple," he said. "Robert Bishop leaves all remaining assets, of which there are none to be divided equally between his daughters Kelly and Claire Bishop." Nothing. We'd already taken everything through the secured loan default. The house, the business, all of it was already mine. "However," Simmons continued, "there is an addendum. Mr. Bishop added this by hand 2 weeks before his death and had it notarized here in my office." He pulled out a single page, my father's handwriting unmistakable. "To Kelly, I know you don't want my money. You've already taken the house and business which you earned through my debt. Instead, I leave you the only thing of value I have left, the truth." Simmons slid an envelope across the desk. Inside were documents I'd never seen, evidence that made everything suddenly horribly clear. Text messages between Marcus Grafton and my father, time-stamped from the week before David died. "We need to take care of the engineer problem. He's meeting with the inspector Monday morning. I'll handle it. Just make sure you're nowhere near the site." Photographs of the scaffolding bolts, clearly showing the tool marks taken by Marcus himself, apparently as leverage over my father. insurance in case my father ever tried to turn on him, and a handwritten confession, my father's writing dated a week before his stroke. Marcus Grafton tampered with the scaffolding that caused David Chen's death. I covered for him because he threatened to expose my fraud to destroy what remained of my business and reputation. I was a coward. I let an innocent man's death go unpunished to protect myself. These documents prove manslaughter. I am sorry. I stared at the papers, this final gift from a dying man. Not redemption, he was beyond that, but accountability, truth. The last piece of evidence needed to ensure Marcus Grafton would spend the rest of his life in prison. Mark leaned over to read the documents, his expression darkening. This is everything the DA needs. With these text messages and photos, they can prove Marcus deliberately sabotaged the scaffolding. Combined with the fraud charges, this becomes premeditated. Not just manslaughter, potentially murder charges. Will it bring David back? I asked, hearing the exhaustion in my own voice. No, but it will clear his name completely, remove any remaining doubt about his innocence, and it will ensure the person who actually killed him faces appropriate consequences. I looked at the documents, at my father's confession, at the evidence that would destroy Marcus Grafton. I thought about David, about justice, about whether there was any point to continuing to fight battles that wouldn't heal the wounds they were meant to address. File everything, I said finally. Give it all to D.A. Moreno. Marcus Grafton killed my husband and let his reputation be destroyed to cover it up. If my father's final act was to expose that truth, then let's honor the one decent thing he did at the end of a thoroughly indecent life. Mark gathered the documents carefully. I'll deliver these this afternoon. We left the lawyer's office, Claire heading to her car without speaking, my mother already gone. As I reached my own car, Howard Simmons called after me. Ms. Bishop, wait. There's one more thing. He held out a yellowed envelope, the paper soft with age. This was in your father's personal safe. It's addressed to you, but it's not his handwriting. I took the envelope and my breath caught. David's handwriting. My name written in his careful script, and below it, words that made time stop. To Kelly, to be delivered if I don't come home. My hands shook as I held this letter from beyond the grave, this message from the man I'd lost 8 years ago. A message my father had kept from me all this time, hidden away like all his other secrets. He had this, I asked Simmons, my voice barely steady. It was in his safe. I don't know why he never gave it to you. I'm sorry. I sat in my car, the letter on the passenger seat, unable to bring myself to open it. Not yet. Not here. Some things required solitude, required preparation, required a willingness to break open one more time. I drove away from Cedar Grove, away from the grave and the lawyer's office and the wreckage of my family, carrying David's final words, and wondering what he could possibly have wanted to say to me in those last hours before everything ended. I drove to a parking garage in downtown Minneapolis, found the highest empty level, and parked in the corner farthest from the elevator. Privacy. Silence. Space to break apart if I needed to. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I turned it over, studying David's handwriting, the way he formed my name with those careful loops, the slight tilt to his letters that came from being left-handed. This piece of paper had existed for 8 years, hidden in my father's safe, kept from me like everything else that might have brought comfort. I opened it carefully, as if the paper might disintegrate, and began to read. My dearest Kelly, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I'm so sorry. I know what I'm about to do tomorrow is dangerous, not physically, I thought, but in terms of consequences. Your father is desperate, and desperate men do unpredictable things. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to keep reading. I want you to know I chose to confront this fraud not despite loving you, but because I love you. You deserve a life built on truth, not the lies your family trained you to accept. I'd rather risk everything than let you build your dreams on someone else's corruption. If something happens to me, please don't let grief stop you. Build our company. Design beautiful buildings. Help people create homes. The tears came harder now, and I had to pause, pressing the letter against my chest, as if I could somehow absorb his words directly into my heart. And Kelly, forgive your family eventually, not for them, but for yourself. Carrying their poison will only hurt you. I love you more than words. You are enough. You were always enough. David. I broke. Completely, utterly broke. 8 years of holding myself together shattered in that parking garage, and I sobbed like I hadn't let myself sob since the day they'd called to tell me he was gone. I cried for David, for the man who'd seen me and loved me and died trying to protect me from my own family's corruption. I cried for the life we'd planned, the company we'd build together, the house full of light, the children we'd talked about naming Emma and James. I cried for the woman I'd been before his death, the Kelly who could laugh easily and trust people and believe that good things could happen without cost. Revenge had given me power, but it had stolen my peace. Justice had given me vindication, but not happiness. And David, who'd loved me enough to die for integrity, wouldn't have wanted me to become this hardened thing I'd turned into. He'd wanted me to forgive, to heal, to build something beautiful. Instead, I'd spent 8 years tearing things down. A knock on my car window made me jump. Sarah stood there, her expression concerned. I hadn't even heard her approach. I unlocked the door and she slid into the passenger seat without asking permission. We sat in silence while I tried to pull myself together, wiping my face with my sleeves like a child. Sarah didn't try to comfort me with words, just sat present, breathing beside me. Finally, she spoke. David told me something during our last call, something I wrote down because it seemed important, even though I didn't understand it then. He said, if something happens to me, make sure Kelly knows that healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering with love instead of pain. I looked at her, this woman who'd been a stranger months ago and had become something like family. I didn't understand what he meant, Sarah continued. But watching you these past weeks, I think I do now. You've been running on anger for so long you've forgotten how to rest. You've been fighting so hard, you've forgotten how to just be. She reached over and took my hand, and I let her, this small gesture of connection, feeling both foreign and necessary. You've won, Kelly. You've exposed the truth. You've cleared David's name. You've held everyone accountable. The DA has all the evidence. Marcus Grafton will spend the rest of his life in prison. Your father died knowing his crimes were public. You've done everything you set out to do. She squeezed my hand gently. But now what revenge is over? Justice is served. What comes after? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that terrified me more than any confrontation with my parents ever had. What came after? Who was I when I wasn't fighting? What did I want when I wasn't seeking vengeance? I looked at Sarah, at David's sister, who had his eyes and his capacity for kindness, and asked the question I'd been too afraid to voice even to myself. What if I don't know who I am without anger? What if being strong was just another performance and underneath, I'm as broken as they are? The words hung in the car between us, this admission that everything I'd built, the company, the reputation, the armor of success, might be just another version of my parents' facades. What if I'd spent 8 years becoming exactly what I'd been fighting against? What if the only difference between me and my father was that my destruction had been legal? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the city beyond the parking garage, at the skyline David had helped build, at the world that kept turning regardless of our private catastrophes. Then maybe, she said finally, it's time to find out who you are when you're not performing anything, when you're not the strong one or the successful one or the vengeful one. Just Kelly. Just you without any role to play. I looked down at David's letter still clutched in my hand and read the last line again. You are enough. You were always enough. Maybe it was time to find out if that was true. My mother appeared at my office 3 days after the funeral. Jennifer buzzed me, her voice uncertain. Ms. Bishop, there's a Linda Bishop here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. I almost told Jennifer to send her away. But something, curiosity, exhaustion, maybe the lingering effect of David's letter telling me to forgive, made me say, send her in. The woman who entered my office looked nothing like the imposing matriarch of my childhood. She was small, shrunken by grief and age, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight it couldn't afford to lose. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she had permission to enter. Kelly. My name came out tentative testing. Thank you for seeing me. I gestured to the chair across from my desk but didn't offer any warmth. What do you want, Mom? She sat carefully, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I have no right to it. I'm here because you deserve to understand. You deserve to know why I made the choices I made, even if they were all wrong. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. I'm listening. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than I expected. I married your father when I was 20 years old. He seemed stable, reliable, safe. Everything my own chaotic childhood hadn't been. But by our 3rd anniversary, he'd become controlling, violent. Not all the time, that's what made it hard to leave. He'd be wonderful for weeks, then something would set him off and he'd explode. By the time you were born, I was trapped. No money of my own, no job skills, no family support. I'd been conditioned to believe I couldn't survive without him. I'd heard versions of this story before, explanations meant to excuse the inexcusable. But I stayed quiet, let her continue. When your father hit you that night when you were 8, when I found you hiding in that closet with bruises on your face, something broke in me. Or maybe something finally woke up. I threatened to leave to expose him, to take you girls and disappear. For the first time in years, I meant it. Her hands twisted the purse strap. But he called my bluff. He said I'd lose custody in court, that judges favor fathers with stable jobs and money. He said he'd tell everyone I was unstable, that I'd abandoned my children. He was probably lying, the law doesn't work that way. But I believed him. I was so beaten down, I believed everything he told me. So you made a deal, I said, my voice flat. He'd never touch you again if I kept you at a distance from him. If I made sure you were never alone with him, never close enough for him to hurt again. It sounds insane now, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to protect you, distance as safety. And then Claire was born. My mother's face crumpled. Robert discovered she wasn't his within weeks. Different blood type on the hospital records. He had the DNA test done when she was 6 months old. I confessed before he could confront me, a man from my support group for abuse survivors, a moment of weakness when I thought I might leave Robert and needed to feel like someone saw me as human. She wiped her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her purse. Robert agreed to stay to raise Claire as his own on one condition: I'd help him hide his business problems. I'd sign whatever documents he needed, make whatever calls, be complicit in whatever fraud kept the money coming in. Every crime he committed after that, I enabled. And he punished me by pouring affection onto Claire, the living proof of my betrayal. Every time he favored her over you, he was punishing me. You became collateral damage in our toxic marriage. The explanation didn't excuse anything, but it added context I'd never had. My mother wasn't a villain in a fairy tale. She was a woman who'd made terrible choices from a position of powerlessness, and those choices had destroyed her daughters. Why didn't you just leave? I asked the question I'd been holding for 30 years. Her answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. Because I didn't think I could, and by the time I realized I was stronger than I believed, too many years had passed. Too many lies, too much complicity, too much shame. I was trapped by my own choices, as much as by your father. She stood, not waiting for a response, not expecting one. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me. But I wanted you to know that every terrible thing I did came from fear, not malice. I was weak, Kelly. So weak. And you paid the price for my weakness every day of your childhood. I'm sorry. It's not enough, but it's all I have. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle. You asked me once if I loved your father. I'll tell you what I should have said then. I loved who I hoped we both could become. But we never did. We just became smaller, meaner, more damaged versions of ourselves. Don't make that mistake. Don't love potential. Don't waste your life fighting ghosts. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with questions that had no satisfying answers. Could I forgive someone who'd destroyed me, even while being destroyed themselves? Was understanding the same as absolution? Where was the line between explaining and excusing? That night I dreamed I was 8 years old again, hiding in the closet, my cheek throbbing where my father had hit me. I could smell my mother's coats, feel the darkness pressing in. Then the door opened and my mother was there, younger, kneeling down to my level. But in the dream, she didn't just comfort me. She took my hand, pulled me out of that closet, and we walked together out the front door of that house. We kept walking away from Cedar Grove, away from my father, away from everything that had hurt us. We walked until we found somewhere safe, somewhere new, somewhere we could both be free. I woke up crying. David's pillow clutched to my chest, and understood something I'd been refusing to see. The little girl in me who'd needed her mother's protection was still there, still hiding in that closet, still waiting for someone to pull her out into the light. Maybe healing wasn't about forgiving my mother for failing me. Maybe it was about finally being the adult who could rescue that child myself. Sarah's call came 2 days after my mother's visit. "Kelly, your sister checked herself into psychiatric treatment at Willow Ridge. She listed you as her emergency contact. The facility wants permission to discuss her treatment plan." I sat in stunned silence. Claire had checked herself in voluntarily, and somehow, impossibly, she'd listed me as the person to call in crisis. Me, the sister who'd taken everything from her. The facility was exactly what I expected, discreetly expensive, tucked into wooded grounds north of Minneapolis, the kind of place where wealthy families sent their broken members to be fixed quietly. As I signed in at the desk, I realized with a start that the billing information on file was connected to a trust I'd set up months ago before everything exploded. A small fund I'd established for Claire when I'd taken the house and business guilt money I'd told myself was about fairness, but was really about not becoming entirely like my father. Claire was in a common area, sunlight streaming through large windows. She looked fragile, her skin almost translucent, but her eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. She stood when she saw me, uncertain. "You came. You listed me as your emergency contact. I wasn't going to ignore that." I sat in one of the comfortable chairs, and she took the one across from me. "I'm an alcoholic," she said, no preamble, no softening. "And I've been dealing with eating disorders since I was 15. After Dad died and I found out that he wasn't really my father, that everything I believed about my life was a lie, I spiraled. I was drinking 2 bottles of wine a day, not eating, taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to feel nothing." She pulled up her sleeve, showing a hospital bracelet beneath her regular one. "I woke up in the ER 3 days ago. Sarah found me unconscious in my apartment. Alcohol poisoning combined with malnutrition. The doctor said if she'd found me an hour later..." She didn't finish the sentence. "I'm the golden child who got everything and became nothing," Claire said with a bitter laugh. "How's that for irony? You were ignored and became successful. I was worshipped and became this." We sat in that sunlit room, and for the first time in our lives, we talked honestly. No performance, no competition, no parents mediating every interaction with their toxic dynamics. "I always knew their love was wrong," Claire admitted. "It didn't feel good. It felt like pressure, like walking on a tightrope where one mistake would make me fall. You got to be real. You got to fail and succeed on your own terms. I envied that." "You had a family," I countered. "Flawed and toxic, but present. I had nothing. I built my life from scratch with no foundation. Do you know how terrifying that is?" "We both lost," Claire said quietly. "That's what I'm finally understanding. There was no winner in the Bishop family. Mom and Dad managed to damage both their daughters equally, just in different ways. You were neglected. I was smothered. You were told you weren't enough. I was told I was everything, which is just another way of being told you're nothing real, just a projection. The truth of it settled between us. We hadn't been competing sisters. We'd been two children caught in the crossfire of our parents' war, both casualties, neither victor. "Why are you paying for this treatment?" Claire asked suddenly. "After everything I said, everything I did after I defended them when you were trying to expose the truth." I thought about David's letter, about breaking cycles, about being someone different than the people who'd raised us. Because David taught me something before he died. That breaking cycles of harm requires someone to make a different choice. Our parents hurt us both. I hurt you back when I took everything. We could keep hurting each other forever, or one of us could stop. I met her eyes. "I'm tired, Claire. I'm tired of fighting." Claire's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can ever be the sister you deserved. I don't even know who I am without them defining me. But I'd like to try, if you'll let me." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness required time, required Claire to do the work of recovery, required me to do the work of letting go. But it was a beginning, a possibility. Two sisters who'd spent 30 years as strangers finding their way toward something that might eventually resemble family. I stood to leave, and Claire stood too. Awkwardly, tentatively, she held out her arms. I stepped into the hug, and we held each other like two people who'd survived the same shipwreck finally reaching shore. My phone rang as I walked to my car, Mark's name on the screen. "Kelly, the DA's office just called. Marcus Grafton wants to make a deal. He'll plead guilty to manslaughter in David's death if you agree not to pursue civil damages. He's trying to protect his family's remaining assets from lawsuits. They want to know what you want." I stood in the parking lot, hand on my car door, and thought about revenge and justice and the difference between the two. I thought about Marcus Grafton's daughters innocent, like Claire had been innocent, about to lose everything because of their father's crimes. "What do I want?" I repeated. "Give me 24 hours. I need to think about what justice actually looks like." 24 hours later, I sat in a conference room at the DA's office with Mark and Assistant DA Patricia Moreno. Marcus Grafton's plea offer lay on the table between us like a test I hadn't studied for. "Let me lay out your options clearly," Moreno said, her fingers steepled. "Option 1, reject the plea, go to trial. It'll be public, messy, and there's no guaranteed conviction. Juries are unpredictable and Grafton's lawyers are excellent. Option 2, accept the plea. Grafton serves 12 to 15 years for manslaughter, admits guilt on the record, and David's name is fully cleared. His family keeps their home and remaining assets." She paused, and I saw calculation in her eyes. "Option 3, we go harder. We have evidence suggesting Grafton's wife Patricia knew about some of the fraudulent activities. She signed documents, attended meetings. If you pursue maximum civil damages, we can pressure her to testify against her husband, which would strengthen the criminal case, but likely implicate her in conspiracy charges." "What would that mean for her?" I asked. "Prison time, probably. Asset forfeiture. Everything." Moreno slid a folder across the table. "Grafton has 2 daughters, 15 and 17. If both parents are incarcerated and all assets are seized, they'd likely go into the foster system or live with relatives, assuming any relatives would take them after this scandal." I opened the folder. School photos. 2 girls with their father's dark hair and their mother's smile, holding musical instruments, wearing soccer uniforms. Normal teenagers whose lives were about to be destroyed by their father's crimes. The 15-year-old looked like Claire at that age, all awkward angles and desperate to please smiles. I imagined it in detail, these girls coming home to find their mother arrested, their house seized, their college funds gone. Their father already in prison, now their mother too. Losing everything because I decided that justice required total destruction. They'd done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong man, and I'd be the one who chose to devastate them. Just like my father had chosen to devastate me. Mark leaned forward, his voice quiet. "Kelly, if you do this, you become him. You become the person who destroys families to satisfy your own need for revenge. You'll take everything from innocent children because their father hurt you." He met my eyes. "Is that who David loved? Is that who you want to be?" The question hit like a physical blow. I saw myself suddenly from the outside, a woman so consumed by the need for vengeance that I was willing to orphan 2 teenage girls to take from them what had been taken from me. I'd spent 8 years becoming strong, becoming successful, becoming powerful enough to fight back. And I'd arrived at the exact same place as my father, willing to sacrifice innocent people to feed my own pain. David's words from his letter echoed in my mind. "Forgive your family eventually, not for them but for yourself. Carrying their poison will only hurt you." I'd been carrying poison for 8 years. It had made me powerful, but it had also been killing me slowly, turning me into exactly what I'd been fighting against. I took a breath, feeling something shift inside me, some hardened thing beginning to crack. "I'll accept the plea deal. Marcus Grafton pleads guilty to manslaughter, serves his time, and David's name is cleared on the public record. I won't pursue civil damages against his family." Moreno looked genuinely surprised. "Ms. Bishop, you're entitled to millions in compensation. The civil case is almost guaranteed to succeed." "I'm entitled to justice," I said, my voice steady. "Justice is Grafton in prison and the truth on the record. I'm not entitled to destroy his children's lives because I'm angry. Those girls didn't sabotage the scaffolding. They didn't kill David. They're innocent." I closed the folder with their photos. "That's where I draw the line. That's where this cycle of destroying families ends." Mark smiled, something like pride in his expression. "I'll inform Grafton's attorneys we accept the plea." Walking out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. Like I'd been carrying a weight so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I hadn't forgiven Marcus Grafton. I never would. But I'd chosen not to become him. And that choice felt more powerful than any revenge ever had. I drove home slowly, windows down, breathing in the autumn air. My phone buzzed with messages, Sarah checking in Claire's facility, sending a progress update, work emails that could wait. I ignored them all, just drove through the city. David and I had loved the city where we'd planned to build our life together. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw it immediately, an envelope on my doorstep, no postage, hand-delivered. I picked it up, recognizing my mother's handwriting on the front. Inside was a check for $150,000 and a note on plain paper. "Kelly, this is every penny I have left from selling my jewelry, my car, everything I owned that wasn't already taken. It won't undo anything I did. It won't give you back your childhood or your husband or the years I stole from you. But it's the exact amount you gave us 8 years ago, the money that was supposed to be for your college, for your dreams. You deserve to follow those dreams then. Maybe you still do. Maybe it's not too late to build something that's yours, not built on revenge or anger or fighting. Just yours. I'm sorry we'll never be enough. But I am sorry. Mom." I sat on my front steps, holding the check and the note, and for the first time since I'd started this war with my family, I cried not from grief or rage, but from something simpler, exhaustion mixed with the faintest edge of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to become someone David would recognize, someone I could recognize, someone who wasn't defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do next. I sat in my mansion that evening, the house I'd built as a monument to loss but had never truly lived in. David's letter lay on the coffee table beside my mother's check. 2 pieces of paper that represented everything I'd lost, and everything I might still become. The house was beautiful. Everyone said so, but it was empty in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. I'd built a memorial when what I needed was a home. I opened my laptop intending to catch up on work emails, but instead found myself opening a blank document. Not architectural drawings this time, just words. Ideas. Within an hour, the ideas had structure. Within 3 hours, they'd become a plan. The David Chen Foundation for Women in Trades, a nonprofit providing scholarships, training, and mentorship for women entering construction, engineering, and architecture. fields where I'd had to fight for every scrap of respect where David had believed women belonged, but too few ever got the chance to prove it. I'd fund it with the assets I'd taken from my parents' estate, with my mother's check, with my own money. Not as revenge or restitution, but as transformation. Turning the wreckage of my family into something that could help other women build lives my parents had tried to prevent me from having. By midnight, I had a mission statement, a budget outline, and the beginning of a scholarship application. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, excited about building rather than destroying. Claire called 2 days later, her voice clearer than I'd heard it since childhood. "I heard about the foundation. Sarah told me. I want to help." "Claire, you need to focus on your recovery. You've been in treatment less than 2 weeks." "That's exactly why I need this." Her words came fast, urgent. "I've been decorative and useless my whole life. I need to be part of something that actually matters. I can't engineer buildings or mentor women in construction, but I can fundraise. I spent years at charity galas being Dad's perfect daughter. I know every wealthy person in 3 states. I know how to work a room, how to make the ask, how to turn sympathy into donations. Let me do this. Let me be useful for once." I hesitated, weighing the risk of bringing Claire into something that mattered this much. But maybe that was the point. Maybe we both needed to be part of something larger than our damage. "Okay, but you do it sober and healthy. That's non-negotiable. 1 relapse and you step back until you're ready." "Deal." I heard relief in her voice. "Thank you for trusting me. I won't let you down." Sarah Chen's involvement was immediate and enthusiastic. "David would have loved this," she said when I told her about the foundation. "He always said construction was a boys' club that needed to be demolished, that the industry would be better when women weren't fighting just to be allowed in the room." Together, we built something comprehensive. Full scholarships covering tuition, books, and living expenses. Tool grants because quality equipment was expensive and necessary. Placement assistance connecting graduates with companies committed to diversity. Mentorship pairing each scholarship recipient with an established woman in her chosen field. We'd name the first cohort the David Chen Scholars. The foundation's motto came from his letter, "Build on truth, not lies." The work was consuming in the best way. Within 3 months, we'd secured 501c3 nonprofit status, raised $2 million through Claire's relentless fundraising and my industry connections, and selected our first class of 20 scholarship recipients from over 300 applicants. Young women who'd been told construction wasn't for girls, who'd been discouraged from engineering programs, who'd fought their way into architecture schools, despite everyone telling them to choose something more feminine. The launch event was scheduled for a Saturday evening in November, held at a restored warehouse my company had renovated 3 years ago. 200 people confirmed attendance: donors, industry leaders, scholarship recipients and their families, journalists covering the story of the architect who'd turned family tragedy into opportunity for others. I stood backstage in the building's green room, reviewing my speech notes, my hands shaking slightly with nervousness I hadn't felt since my first major client presentation years ago. This mattered more than any building I'd designed. This was David's legacy made tangible. This was proof that destruction could become creation, that pain could become purpose. Sarah poked her head in. 5 minutes. You ready? As I'll ever be. I walked to the stage entrance, took a breath, and stepped into the light. The room was full, faces turning toward me expectantly. I scanned the crowd as I walked to the microphone, seeing Claire in the front row looking healthy and present, seeing Sarah standing with our board members, seeing scholarship recipients clutching folders with their award letters. And in the back row, sitting alone, uninvited, but present, my mother. Small and gray and watching me with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment the speech I'd prepared vanished from my mind. Then I looked at the scholarship recipients, at these young women whose futures I could help shape, and I found my voice. I gripped the microphone stand, steadying myself, and began. 8 years ago, my husband David Chen died because someone chose profit over safety, convenience over integrity. For years I blamed myself. If I'd come from a different family, if I'd had different connections, maybe he'd still be alive. But that thinking kept me trapped in the past, unable to move forward. I paused, scanning the faces in the audience. This foundation exists because David believed that strong structures, whether buildings, relationships, or lives, must be built on truth. Not convenience, not profit. Truth. I told them the story I'd never shared publicly before, not the sanitized version for news interviews, but the real one. The family that had abandoned me, that had missed my wedding because my sister's art opening mattered more. The husband who'd loved me fiercely and died trying to expose corruption. The years of grief that had curdled into rage, the revenge that had left me emptier than the loss itself. I thought justice meant punishment. I thought making the people who hurt me suffer would somehow heal me. But real justice isn't about destruction. Real justice means ensuring what happened to David doesn't happen to anyone else. It means building something that lasts, something that helps people who are fighting the same battles we fought. It means turning pain into purpose. I gestured to the scholarship recipients seated in the front rows. These 20 women are the first David Chen scholars. Each of them has fought to be here. Each has been told that construction isn't for girls, that engineering is too hard, that architecture is a man's profession. Each has persisted anyway. They are the future David believed in. I invited them to stand, and the audience applauded. Then I asked Maria Rodriguez, a 19-year-old aspiring civil engineer from South Minneapolis, to share her story. Maria walked to the microphone with confidence that belied her age. My father was a construction worker. He died on a job site when I was 12 years old. Unsafe conditions, expired equipment, a foreman who valued speed over safety. Nobody was held accountable. The company blamed my father for the accident, said he should have been more careful. Her voice caught, but held steady. When I saw what Ms. Bishop was building, when I learned about David Chen and how he died trying to protect workers, I saw a path forward, a way to make sure other girls don't lose their fathers the way I lost mine. This scholarship isn't just about my education. It's about changing an industry that treats workers as disposable. That's what I'm going to dedicate my career to. The audience was silent, moved. I looked at Maria and saw myself at 19, determined and damaged, and hoping that hard work could somehow make the pain mean something. After the formal program ended, people stayed for hours talking and networking and celebrating. Claire worked the room with surprising grace, connecting donors with scholarship recipients. Her fundraiser instincts strong despite months of absence from that world. Sarah stood with the scholarship recipients answering questions about David, about what he'd been like keeping his memory alive in ways I couldn't, because grief still choked me sometimes when I tried to speak about him. Eventually, the crowd thinned. I walked out to the parking lot, exhausted but satisfied, and found my mother standing beside my car. We stood in awkward silence, the space between us filled with everything we'd never said and never would. Finally, she spoke. I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but it's true. You became everything I couldn't be, strong enough to break the cycle, brave enough to build something good from something terrible. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. You're the woman I should have been. I didn't know what to say. Pride from her felt strange, unwanted decades too late. I'm not asking for a relationship, she continued quickly, reading my expression. I'm not asking you to forgive me or call me or pretend we're a normal mother and daughter. I'm just asking not to be cut off completely. Maybe we could have coffee once a year. Or you could send me updates about the foundation. Something small. Can we try that? I thought about David's letter about forgiveness being for yourself rather than the person who hurt you. I thought about Claire in treatment working to heal. I thought about breaking cycles and choosing differently. We can try, I said finally. I'm not promising more than that, but we can try. Relief washed over her face. She nodded, started to walk away, then stopped. Thank you, Kelly. As she reached her car, something made me call out, Mom. She turned, waiting. Did you love Dad, ever? She stood quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I loved who I hoped he'd become. That's the trap I fell into, loving potential instead of reality, loving the man I imagined he could be rather than the man he was. It destroyed both of us. She looked at me directly. Don't make my mistake, Kelly. Love people as they are or don't love them at all. Don't waste your life on potential that never materializes. She got in her car and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with wisdom that came too late for her, but maybe just in time for me. 6 months after the Foundation's launch, my life looked nothing like I'd imagined it would. The David Chen Foundation had become my primary focus, the work that got me out of bed each morning with purpose, rather than obligation. Bishop Design and Build still operated successfully, more successfully than ever actually, but I'd hired a managing partner named Jennifer Wu to handle daily operations. She was brilliant, detail-oriented, and didn't need me hovering over every decision. It freed me to do what mattered: mentoring scholarship recipients, speaking at industry conferences about safety and integrity, and designing my next project. Second Chances Housing. Affordable, well-built homes for women rebuilding their lives after domestic violence, addiction, or incarceration. Not shelters, but actual homes with dignity and permanence built into every beam and wall. I was working with the city to secure land with donors, to fund construction with social services, to identify women who needed what I was building. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. Claire had been sober for 6 months. She ran the Foundation's donor relations department with competence that surprised both of us. She had a gift for making wealthy people feel good about giving their money away, for connecting donors' values to the Foundation's mission, for turning sympathy into substantial checks. We met every Tuesday morning for coffee at a cafe halfway between our apartments. The conversations were still awkward, sometimes still marked by the weight of our history, but they were real. We weren't pretending to be the sisters we'd never been. We were becoming something new, 2 women who'd survived the same wreckage, building a relationship from scratch, without our parents' toxicity shaping every interaction. Sarah Chen had become my closest friend, the sister I'd chosen rather than the one genetics had assigned me. She understood grief in ways Claire never could understood what it meant to lose someone, and then discover you'd never fully known them. We talked about David, often keeping his memory alive, not as a saint or a martyr, but as a real person who'd been flawed and funny and frustratingly idealistic in the best possible way. And then there was Mark. Mark Reeves had been a constant presence through everything: David's friend first, then my lawyer, then just Mark. Somewhere in the past year, something had shifted. He'd show up with coffee when I was working late at the Foundation office. He'd text me articles about architecture or construction safety he thought I'd find interesting. He'd listen when I talked about David without trying to compete with a ghost. 3 months ago, after a Foundation board meeting, he'd asked if I wanted to grab dinner. Not as colleagues or friends, but as something more. I'd said yes before I could overthink it. It was different from what I'd had with David. Less intense, more peaceful. Mark had his own grief: a wife who'd died of cancer 6 years ago, a loss that had reshaped him the way David's death had reshaped me. We didn't try to replace what we'd lost. We were building something new from who we'd become, not who we'd been. When I worried aloud that moving forward felt like betraying David's memory, Mark had taken my hand and said, "David's last message to you was to live fully, to build beautiful things, to be happy. He'd be furious if you spent your life as a memorial to him instead of honoring him by actually living." He was right. David would have hated the idea of me frozen in grief building monuments instead of moving forward. Today I stood on the porch of my mansion, the $2 million house I'd built as a monument to loss and never truly inhabited. Workers were installing a new sign by the driveway: the David Chen Foundation Building, Truth Creating Opportunity. I decided to convert the house into the Foundation's headquarters and training center. The workshop David would never use would become a space where scholarship recipients learned to use tools safely. The empty bedrooms would become offices and meeting rooms. The kitchen where I'd never cooked would feed students during weekend workshops. It would no longer be my private memorial. It would be a public space where women learned to build their own futures. Inside, I'd placed one item on the mantel in what used to be the living room, our wedding photo. David and me under that oak tree smiling despite the empty chairs visible in the background. I stood in front of it alone in the house for the last time before it stopped being mine. I kept my promise, I whispered to his image. I became the woman you believed I could be. I built the company we dreamed about. I'm helping people the way you would have. I hope you're proud. I hope wherever you are, you know that your death meant something, that you meant something. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Mark appeared in the doorway, respectful of my moment, but present. Through the window, I could see Claire on the porch laughing into her phone as she coordinated an upcoming fundraising gala, fully alive in a way she'd never been when our parents were defining her. Sarah was in what would become the conference room reviewing scholarship applications for our second cohort, her laptop surrounded by folders. This was family now. Not the family I'd been born into with its toxicity and favoritism and casual cruelty, but the family I'd chosen, the family I'd built from the ruins of everything that had tried to destroy me. Imperfect, complicated, real. My phone buzzed. An email from Maria Rodriguez, the scholarship recipient who'd spoken at our launch event. The subject line, "I got the job." I opened it, smiling. Ms. Bishop, I just accepted a position at Hennepin County Public Works as a junior civil engineer. They're letting me work on the bridge safety inspection program. I start next month. Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would. I promise I won't let you down. I typed back quickly. You could never let me down. You've already succeeded by becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Congratulations. David would be so proud. I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The sun was setting over Minneapolis, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The city David had helped build, the city where I'd lost him and found myself. I no longer waited for the next disaster, the next betrayal, the next fight. I was done fighting ghosts. I was done being defined by what had been done to me. I was finally truly home. Mark joined me on the porch and we stood together watching the light fade. After a moment, I turned to him and said something I hadn't been able to say until now. You know what, I think I'm ready to sell that house after all. Time to build something new. He smiled, understanding what I meant. Not just a new house, but a new life. One built on truth instead of lies, on creation instead of destruction, on hope instead of revenge. Where should we start looking? He asked. I thought about David's letter about building on truth, about loving people as they are instead of who you hope they'll become. I thought about Claire learning to be useful, about Sarah keeping David's memory alive, about 20 women learning trades that would let them build their own futures. Somewhere with good light, I said, and room for a workshop, just in case. Mark laughed and the sound was warm and real and full of possibility. We walked down the steps together toward whatever came next, leaving the monument behind, and stepping into a future I was finally ready to build. And that's the story of Kelly Bishop, a woman who transformed pain into power, betrayal into opportunity for others. From the daughter abandoned on her wedding day, Kelly rose to become a successful architect, reclaimed justice for her late husband, and most importantly, learned to let go of revenge to find true peace. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but choosing not to become them. Kelly could have continued down the path of vengeance. She could have destroyed Marcus Grafton's family the way hers was destroyed. But she chose differently. She chose to build instead of destroy. She chose to create opportunities for others instead of just taking from those who hurt her. David Chen is gone, but his legacy lives on through the scholarship fund bearing his name, through the young women given chances to pursue their dreams through Kelly, finally finding happiness not built on anger, but on purpose. What about you? Have you ever faced betrayal from family? Did you choose revenge or forgiveness? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Smash the like button if you think Kelly made the right choices, or leave a comment if you disagree. Every comment, every like, every share helps us bring you more stories that matter. Thank you for staying with Kelly's story until the very end. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore more stories about strength, courage, and the journey to rediscover yourself. Until then, remember, you are enough. You were always enough.